Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Atlantic Council. I'm Paula Derbriansky, Vice Chair of the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's event, the renewal of transatlantic relations in an era of strategic competition. We are so delighted to be joined today by a very distinguished group of policymakers and experts as we examine how democratic allies can renew transatlantic cooperation given the full range of critical challenges facing the world today. We are especially pleased to welcome Ambassador Philip Reeker, the Acting Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, to today's keynote discussion and look forward to hearing his insights on this important issue. And I want to say, as a former colleague, I also want to just welcome him personally. Transatlantic cooperation is more important than ever. As President Biden and other leaders have highlighted, the world is entering a new era of strategic competition in which autocratic rivals are seeking to undermine and replace the rules-based order that was established by the United States and its allies following the Second World War. China and Russia have both grown increasingly assertive as they push back against the principles of founding the rules-based order. And also the challenges they pose are setting the terms for a longer-term struggle between democracies and autocracies, and that is really likely to play out through the foreseeable future. In addition, transatlantic partners must contend with a full range of other global challenges, starting with the continuing effects of the coronavirus pandemic. And despite pledges to increase global vaccine distribution, the virus seems to be outpacing the vaccine in many parts of the world, while the economic impacts of the pandemic are still unfolding. At the same time, we need to be prepared to deal with the scope of threats posed by disruptive technologies, nuclear proliferation, democratic backsliding, and also climate change. Now, in the midst of these challenges, the transatlantic community has a central role to play. President Biden's participation at the G7, NATO, and EU summits last month underscores the United States' reaffirmation of the importance of multilateral alliances. Britain, post-Brexit, has emphasized the need for the transatlantic alliance to remain united. Europe is eager to engage with allies to tackle global challenges, and Canada remains a key player in the transatlantic alliance, highlighting multilateral cooperation while serving as a bridge for strategic cooperation with democratic partners in the Indo-Pacific. Now, convenings such as this are integral to the Scowcroft Center's mission of developing sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and the world. The center honors General Brent Scowcroft's legacy of service and embodies his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership in cooperation with allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. Today's discussion on transatlantic cooperation is part of the Atlantic Council's Democratic Order Initiative, which aims to strengthen cooperation among the United States and democratic allies on a full range of global challenges. And to kick off today's event, we will begin with a keynote discussion with Ambassador Philip Reeker. And then following this, we will have 3 panel discussions. The first panel will cover challenges and opportunities for transatlantic renewal. The second will consider how transatlantic partners can engage democracies in Asia and beyond. And the final panel will examine Canada's role in transatlantic relations. In organizing today's event, we are very pleased to partner with Global Affairs Canada to host this timely discussion on renewing transatlantic cooperation. I'm now going to turn to Patricia Peña, the Director General of Foreign Policy at Global Affairs Canada, to say a few words. Over to you, Director General, and thank you for being here today. And thank you for the cooperation.
Thank you, and good morning to everyone. Welcome. As mentioned, I'm Patricia Pena, and I'm the Director General of Foreign Policy at Global Affairs Canada and the Government of Canada. It is my real pleasure to see so many people attending this conference, and I have no doubts, based on the description of the panels, that today's discussion will be very rich. I'd like to start by thanking the Atlantic Council for their partnership in organizing the event, and to Ambassador and Jabransky for your well-chosen words. So why do we think the conversation about transatlantic relations is important, and why now? Canada has long viewed the transatlantic relationship with the United States and Europe as one that enables collaboration amongst democratic states to address our common goals and issues, geopolitical, economic, and security. It's really a primordial relationship for Canada. It's grounded in a dense network of bilateral and multilateral alliances and organizations, and we see as benefiting from this myriad of complex and interconnecting ties, both historical, political, economic, and importantly, people to people. So for much of the last 80 years, Canada has sought to foster and manage these close relationships with the United States, with European countries, and increasingly with the European Union. We seek to achieve something that is more than the sum of the individual parts, namely a community that shares our political values and is often a first point of reference for much of our global diplomatic activity. So the question is, why do we need this conversation now? Well, challenges to the transatlantic relationship have been acute in recent years, which makes this conversation ever more important. And we see a window and a stated willingness by partners to actually engage on the issues. Now, while there have been periodic political and economic tensions in the post-war transatlantic relationship, arguably, these challenges have become more acute in the last 15 to 20 years. Transatlantic partners have seen their unity challenged by events such as the 2003 Iraq War and the 2008-9 financial crisis. We also all share the common existential threat of climate change and environmental sustainability. We also face structural issues such as burden sharing on European security. And we all have the opportunity to respond and to address issues like competition with Asian states. We're also faced with cleavages when it comes to issues such as the protection and promotion of human rights, including with respect to particular issues within that. So, we see this as being nested within a wider series of challenges to the post-war consensus amongst Western powers, including China's rise, Russia's geopolitical influence, the UK's exit from the European Union, a resurgence of populism in a number of transatlantic states, just to name a few of the issues. We recognize that there isn't a consensus necessarily to address all these issues, but there is an opportunity, and it's a time for us to move it forward. Recent outreach by the US to its traditional transatlantic partners has rekindled some enthusiasm, and there's a sense that Canada, US, and Europe must seize this moment of rapprochement. We have a chance to solidify the foundations of this relationship, the most powerful democratic community in modern history, to drive a new global agenda and to strengthen the rules-based international order. So Canada is firmly committed to this relationship. This was shown, as the ambassador mentioned, at the recent G7 summit, where Prime Minister Trudeau and other G7 leaders made specific commitments to addressing global challenges around COVID and preparing for future pandemics, as well as building back better. We also saw at the NATO summit discussions around threats and challenges to transatlantic security and a commitment to do more, including through the ambitious NATO 2030 agenda. And we've sought to continue strengthening our bilateral relationships with transatlantic partners. So events such as this one are really vital to broadening our perspectives and exchanging ideas. We've had a lot of discussions within Canada and specifically within global affairs, and we've touched on a number of issues such as pandemic emergency response, public health and recovery, the environment and climate action, how to do effective multilateralism, issues around democratic governance and human rights protection, global trade, the digital economy, and on and on. So I hope that during today's discussion, we'll be able to touch on some of these issues, draw new ideas, really hear the debates amongst the best way forward, and see what are the mechanisms and channels we can use to make progress on these through a transatlantic dialogue and relationship. Once again, I'd like to thank the Atlantic Council for organizing this rich program for us today. I really look forward to the discussions, and I appreciate the collaboration, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you so much, Patricia. We really appreciate the collaboration with the Global Affairs Canada, and just it's terrific on this important topic to have this kind of partnership. So thank you for being here today, and thank you for the collaboration. Now, with that, I would like to turn the floor over to Douglas Sanders, who's International Affairs columnist at the Globe and Mail and the Richard von Weizsäcker Fellow at the Robert Bosch Academy, to introduce our honored keynote speaker. And to begin today's discussion, we're going to hear from Ambassador Philip Reeker. So over to you, Douglas, and thank you for being here today.
Yeah, thank you, Paula, and thank you, Patricia, for setting the scene. And especially thank you to Ambassador Philip Reeker for taking the time on what is a very significant day on his file. Ambassador Reeker doesn't need much introduction. He's the Acting Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. This is a particularly fortuitous moment to be engaging with him. Later today, President Joe Biden will meet with Chancellor Angela Merkel in the Oval Office. And I'm sure both the President and Ambassador Reeker hope that today's meetings will mark some kind of a breakthrough, possibly the beginning of a stronger consensus between Europe and the United States on approaches to growing authoritarianism and repression, climate challenges, trade relations, and other urgent files. Ambassador Reeker has a long career as a widely admired figure in U.S. foreign service, including significant postings in Germany, Italy, Macedonia, Iraq, and Hungary. He was appointed to his current position in March, and I think it's fair to say that put him straight in the hot seat, as President Biden had made it clear in a series of speeches that he would be making a return to multilateralism and transatlantic cooperation as a top foreign policy priority for the United States. So, Ambassador Reeker, on this important day in your most challenging file, let me turn to the title of today's event and begin by asking you how you see the prospects for the renewal of transatlantic relations in an era of strategic competition.
Well, thanks, Doug, very much for that. And thank you, Paula Dobriansky. It's great to see you again. We are all reminded of how the years go by. I remember very well the great years when we worked together when you were here at State. And thanks to Patricia Pena for those opening remarks, which frankly could have passed for a perfect keynote address on my behalf too. I'm delighted to have Canada as part of this discussion on transatlantic relations, especially in the dynamic of this era of strategic competition, because Canada is a crucial part of this, not only as a NATO ally, as our literally closest neighbor, but really reminds us that transatlantic is more than just a US-EU or US-Europe construct. And I'm around long enough to remember the days when the European Bureau actually was the Bureau of European and Canadian Affairs. With all respect to my Western Hemisphere Bureau colleagues, we're not making a power grab there, but we certainly work very closely with Canada, particularly through the NATO lens, but also, as mentioned, through G7. I've in fact been in this seat since March of 2019, when I was brought back by the then Secretary Pompeo to lead the Bureau. I had been at U.S. European Command in Stuttgart as the senior civilian and political advisor there, which also reminded us of the importance of Canada in our relationship. Starting, of course, January 21st with the Biden administration and Secretary Blinken coming on shortly thereafter, really from day one of his administration, President Biden has sent a clear message to the world that he wants to repair relations where necessary, revitalize and raise the level of ambition in our relationships, in our partnerships and alliances to meet the challenges of our time. The fact is, as the president says frequently, no one country, even a country as powerful as the United States, both militarily, economically, and with the geographic reach, and dare I say, diplomatically, that we carry out on a daily basis, no one country can deal with some of the challenges we face now. We need to rely on our partnerships and our alliances for security, for economic prosperity, to return, particularly after COVID. And you've heard the president talk about his priorities, the 3 C's: COVID, climate, and China. Sometimes we add a 4th C, which is conflicts. We see regularly conflicts emerging in this hemisphere and in other places, parts of the European theater as well. And we have to work with our partners to do that. I think we've made a great start in this first 6 months, reflecting from the basis of the 75 years of democracy and a rules-based international order that have brought unprecedented peace, prosperity to Europe, to Canada, and to the United States. And certainly we remain very committed to upholding and strengthening democracy, which the president has said is challenged by autocracy. We need to show both at home and abroad that democracy can deliver for its people, for its citizens and voters. Really harkening back to the shared values that set the United States and our like-minded allies and partners apart from the authoritarian competitors that we face both in Russia and in China. I think the transatlantic ties really are a strong foundation for addressing these things. And Secretary Blinken has spent a lot of time in these first months of the administration focusing on building personal relationships, engaging in the multilateral fora that help underscore not only our commitment and our investment in this multilateral system, but stressing some of the enduring values that are a part of that, protecting human rights, which I think is indispensable in dealing with the global challenges, and reminding the world and ourselves of the rules of the road that are so key: openness, fair competition, transparency, accountability, the rule of law, and the cooperation that we've illustrated and experienced with Canada and Europe over these first 6 months of the administration, I think, embody that message extremely well. There's no secret that the president's first trip abroad was a series of summit meetings, multilateral as well as bilateral engagements, starting with the G7 in the UK, including, of course, NATO and the NATO summit, which reflected, as we've heard from Patricia already, on NATO 2030 and the road ahead. The alliance actually in a very strong position to move forward and adapt to the current challenges, whether it's cyber and hybrid threats, also to be thinking about China and how we deal with the challenges as well as opportunities of China, but also climate and looking at how we can protect ourselves in an era of climate change, bolstering security, and also health. COVID-19 has made us all much more aware of the challenges we can face with health and how we have to work together, including things like Gavi and the COVAX facility. In that sense, the United States and Canada work so closely together, along with our European partners, in advancing health security and countering biological threats. We need to be thinking in this period of recovery. We need to think about resilience and how we prevent the next pandemic. And so I think we work with Canada in so many ways on a daily basis, whether it's coordinating sanctions on the Lukashenko regime in Belarus and addressing other regional issues, this sort of global power competition that we're all aware of with Russia, with the People's Republic of China, countries that simply don't see the world in the same way as we do in the transatlantic alliance. And let me just say a couple words on each of those to help start the discussion. The relationship between and among the United States, Canada, Europe, and the People's Republic of China, I think will be the challenge that will help define the next decades, certainly the rest of the 21st century. And the Biden administration has made very clear that we believe the relationship with China will be competitive when it should be, collaborative when it can be, and adversarial when it must be. And that common denominator is the need to engage China from a position of strength and unity with our allies and partners. And I do think we've seen a greater convergence, particularly in the last 6 months, in how we see both the challenges and the opportunities with China. We made very clear that it's not a question of forcing others to choose between the United States and China, or China and the West per se. We obviously engage with China in many ways. The focus is on, again, the rules-based international order, and making China understand that they need to abide by those rules as well if they want to play the role that they certainly should have in a world given their size and their economy. This strategic alignment that has to occur, obviously on a bilateral basis between individual countries or the EU and China, us and China, but we also have the multilateral fora, whether it's the NATO or even the United Nations. I think it's very useful in all of those constructs to look at perspectives like Canada's. That's very valuable for us, and find a united approach to dealing with China in the 21st century. Certainly, again, the underlying theme: we are much stronger, we're more effective when we work together, and that's key when we're addressing China's abusive and coercive economic practices, dumping of products, erecting arbitrary trade barriers, intellectual property threat, and certainly their human rights record, including the use of forced labor. So I see a lot of solidarity with Canada, with the UK, with the EU and other partners in terms of calling on the PRC to end human rights violations and abuses against, for instance, the Muslim Uyghurs and members of other ethnic and religious minority groups in Xinjiang, or what they've done in Hong Kong. A last word mentioning Russia. Obviously, the president, I think, has been very clear. We do not seek escalatory problems with Russia. We're not looking for a reset with Russia. We're being very pragmatic, clear-eyed in saying where we can engage with Russia in things of mutual interest, we're ready to do so. Right out of the gates, we extended the New START Treaty for 5 years. We're working in the days and weeks ahead on strategic stability talks with Russia and other areas like cyber, where we may be able to work together. I think the president very pragmatically addressed some of the areas of Russia's reckless behavior, aggressive behavior, whether it's the solar winds, the interference in our elections, and made clear to President Putin in their phone calls and in their meeting in Geneva that we value and our interest in trying to have a more constructive relationship, but that we will respond to reckless behavior and take action when Russia threatens our interests or those of our partners and allies, whether it's in Ukraine, in Georgia, or elsewhere. The hybrid threats and infringement on sovereignty and territorial integrity in terms of Russia's neighbors are certainly areas of great concern. And they just reflect this general trend that we've seen, where authoritarian regimes are exploiting open societies and seeking to undermine democratic systems of government around the world. And again, that's where we need to join with our like-minded partners and allies and revitalize, frankly, democracy all around the world. So let me stop there, because I know we can go on this topic for a long time. But thank you again for pulling this together. It's a great opportunity, and I'm so pleased to see so many people logged in.
Thank you, Ambassador Reeker. That's a great introduction to your positions. When I speak to foreign ministry officials in Germany and France, for example, I get the message that they fully agree with the United States that there should be a coordinated strategy among the world's democracies for dealing with China and Russia. As you said, to engage China from a position of strength and unity. But there's a hesitancy springing from what I think they see as your administration's approach to China, particularly as being, in one phrase I've heard, like a ratchet that moves in one direction toward ever greater confrontation and more sticks than carrots. They tend to see that pressure and sanctions are important, given the humanitarian atrocities taking place in China. But they should be accompanied by forms of engagement that allow these countries to change. Do you think it's possible on the question of confrontation versus engagement for your administration to meet Europe halfway somehow in the interests of a single democratic voice on these matters, to make compromises in order to build a consensus?
I think it's a great question, and certainly one that's discussed a lot. Again, I go back to the president's clear message and something Secretary Blinken stresses repeatedly. We are not suggesting that any country has to choose between China and the West or China and us, but rather that we in the West, as it's broadly defined in the democratic community of democratic nations, need to be open-eyed and understand what China has been doing over a number of years, whether it is the intellectual property theft, of course, the human rights violations, which go to our fundamental values, but also their efforts to divide us, through a variety of means, disinformation, other tactics that you see coming from Russia as well. And I think we've approached it through steps like the US-EU dialogue on China. From the very beginning and inception of that, which actually began in the previous time of the previous administration, and we were very involved in that, nobody expected that we would come out with a single point of view or perspective on how we were going to deal with China. The EU can't do that among its 27 member states. They have different views, but rather to have a forum where we could truly have a dialogue over, I think we have 6 different pillars that we look at, working groups that discuss and share information, ideas, experiences, on how we can deliver common messages to China about the importance of the international rules-based order. We, as much as anyone, the United States, as much as any country, has for decades now tried to help China pull itself out of poverty, modernize, and you see the results in terms of their enormous economy, but also some of the more negative results in terms of their human rights actions, their bellicose activities in the South China Sea, which have been called out by the international community more broadly, because, as Secretary Blinken said, it's important that we realize when China is treating Uyghurs in Xinjiang as they do, they are violating the International Declaration of Human Rights, things that they've signed up to, and that threatens the whole premise of the rules-based international order of which we have invested so much. And so we're going to call that out. When Russia violates the sovereignty of Ukraine or Georgia, that goes to the fundamentals of the Helsinki Final Act and principles to which they've signed up at the OSCE, and they simply ignore them. So we go back to these basics that we all believe in. And I think through our diplomacy, through our engagement, we're able to then share these ideas, and we may have different individual approaches on different topics, but I think you've seen a lot of consensus come, and I think you'll see that even with Chancellor Merkel's visit today. While we may have different individual approaches on particular subjects, overall there's a broad convergence of how we need to deal with these great power competition questions.
Let me ask you briefly about Canada, where I'm speaking to you from. The last 4 years have been a particularly difficult moment for Canada in its attempts to have relationships with other democracies and with the United States, particularly in its relations with China. Of course, Canada has reached an alarming point in its relations with China, which included de facto hostage crisis that was in many ways precipitated by the Trump administration policies. It's locked out of Russia at the moment with some of the world's more aggressive sanctions. The last 4 years have been a bit of a humbling experience, I think, for Canadian foreign policy officials, as it became clear that Ottawa's commitment to multilateralism had very limited value during periods when it lacked the full support of its largest trading partner and traditional ally in Washington. This has made the Trudeau government a rhetorical champion of the rules-based international order, as its current foreign policy document calls itself, but in a difficult position in that it's reliant on the United States being on the same page. Do you see Canada as being a conduit to Europe, as being what do you see Canada's role in attempting to build an international consensus on these issues?
Well, I see Canada as a member of the G7 and as a founding member of NATO, arguably the most successful defensive alliance in history, which has contributed to creating a space of security and stability in Europe and across the North Atlantic that is really unprecedented in history as well. And it is through that engagement, I think you just can take a look at the recent G7 summit and the communique signed by Canada, as well as the United States, as well as the other G7 countries, and including the European Union, of course, explicitly mentions in that communique China, I think 3 times, talking about COVID and the origin study, talking about the rules-based international system and shared democratic values that I discussed earlier, and in relation to the free and open Indo-Pacific region, the East and South China Seas, the Taiwan Straits. And of course, that's something we share with Canada, is a westward perspective as well, where the Pacific is as much our backyard as the Atlantic is our front yard. And so, we share those challenges with the largest, border, peaceful border, and I think we share the general view in terms of the Build Back Better world that President Biden has described to provide developing countries, and Canada joins us as being a strong deliverer of development assistance and aid, with alternatives, for instance, to China. So there's strong agreement there. The NATO communique similarly, at that summit in Brussels in June, the leaders addressed China for the first time, frankly, in the history of the organization, talking about the security challenges that China poses, and explicitly acknowledges that China's ambitions and assertive behavior present a systemic challenge to the rules-based international order. For us, I think our treaty relationships and obligations have no other precedent, and Canada is, geographically first and foremost in that. And I think that's what's important for Canadians to remember as well, you are parts of these organizations from their founding. And the president has gone out of his way to highlight the importance of these multilateral structures. Multilateralism is important, and Canada is a key partner in all of that. Take a look at a smaller example of what we've been doing together on Belarus. It's a great example of partnership among the US, Canada, and Europe in terms of, again, facing these challenges to the rules-based international order, whether it's Lukashenko bringing down the Ryanair flight to arrest a Belarusian journalist, and just addressing the horrific, brutal crackdown that we've seen there since his fraudulent elections last August. And this was a country where we were trying to approach a better relationship, underscoring our support for the Belarusian people, for the sovereignty of Belarus. Lukashenko chose not to continue down that road when he executed a clearly fraudulent election back in August and then cracked down in response. We've been hand in hand with Canada on this in terms of sanctions, coordination, along with the UK and the EU, and Canada plays a very important role there.
Thanks, Ambassador. I get a sense of friction coming from both Ottawa and the European capitals between the desire to build new multilateral cooperation and initiatives on the political front and trade protectionism happening on the economic front. Your administration has been unapologetically interested in reshoring, Buy America programs, things like that. And it dovetails with a lot of other moves toward nationalist economic policies and protectionist policies in Asia and other places. This is difficult for countries that rely heavily on free and open trade as the basis of their economies, including Canada and the major European economies. Is there a message you can send to try to square the circle between multilateralism in politics and somewhat more unilateral approach in trade matters?
Well, I mean, I do think you have to give some of these things some time. We've actually made some big steps in terms of the trade agenda with the EU by suspending the Boeing Airbus dispute, something that's been around for a long, long time, and moving that out of the way. I think along with the security relationships and the broader approach to multilateralism and revitalizing our alliances and partnerships, the administration's also worked to revitalize and raise ambition, as is often said, in the economic relationship. Certainly, we keep in mind the trade and investment relationship with the EU is over $1 trillion a year in goods and services, and the mutual investment is great. And of course, the US and Canada, that's enormous as well. So I think there's it's a little premature and not fully founded to suggest that's a direction that is new. I think we've actually got to focus, again, as the president has said, first and foremost on dealing with the COVID pandemic and the economic fallout from that, and the recovery, which I think gives us a great opportunity to address some of these issues. And we seem poised for a very strong recovery throughout the entire transatlantic area. Again, we have to address these issues. We're not always going to have exact agreement on at every level. There is competition in the world of international trade, but I think we can find a lot of win-win solutions. The global tax agreements that have been talked about through the G7 framework and the OECD, I think, are very promising and show some real steps in terms of the efforts being made to address those things, the global minimum tax, the Trade and Technology Council at the US-EU summit, leaders there agreed and announced to give a platform to strengthen cooperation on trade and investment is crucial. And of course, we have lots of mechanisms to work with Canada on that.
Very good, thank you. And very briefly, to that end, there's a lot of interest in trying to create new formal institutions for the coordination of transatlantic relations, alliances and democracies. During the Trump years, there were a lot of ad hoc efforts to create alliances of democracies and so on. But it's clear that the leadership of the United States would be vital in creating something new, such as an expansion of the G7 or the creation of, as the Atlantic Council has proposed, a D10 of democratic states. Are you interested in creating or building new multilateral formal institutions?
I certainly don't have anything to announce in that direction. The president has used these first 6 months to underscore and reinvigorate the institutions that we have. I think the G7 is a great basis for that. We also have the G20, and I was just with Secretary Blinken when he attended the G20 ministerial in Matera, Italy, late last month. Those do give us good foundations. Whether we need other structures, I think we can wait and see. Let's strengthen and use the structures we have. I think when it comes to climate, one of the most important things where we share with Canada concerns and how we address these things, the U.S. returning to the Paris agreements, and we're all focused now on the COP26, which is coming up soon in Glasgow, of course. There's a lot of coordination that goes on through that mechanism, and that has security implications, that has economic implications for all of us. And of course, we have the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, who plays a major role in engaging on that. So I do think we've got a lot to work with here, as well as our regular bilateral diplomatic engagement. And there's no country that's closer than Canada in engaging with that.
Thank you, Ambassador, for that substantive response and for this great discussion. I'd like to turn the microphone and camera over to a fellow Canadian, Louisa Savage, who's the Executive Director of Editorial Initiatives at Politico and a Fellow of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. She'll be leading a very significant discussion about the challenges and opportunities of transatlantic renewal. Thank you, Louisa.
Thank you so much, Doug, and thanks for that great conversation, Ambassador. It's actually a particular honor for me to participate in this conversation about the renewal of the transatlantic relationship as someone who has Canadian, American, and European nationalities. So all my favorite countries gathered in one. And also as someone who's really worked to connect the journalistic dots. I work at Politico, which is a global news organization, and it's been a real labor of love for me to create Politico Canada, which we now have up and running in Ottawa, as well as our Global Translations newsletter and podcast, and our China Watcher newsletter, which is really following all these issues. And I heartily recommend them all to you. So thanks for having me here. We're going to tackle the top priorities for transatlantic cooperation, and we're going to look at where there's some potential alignment between the US, Europe, and Canada. But I'm also hoping we'll go beyond some of this high-minded language and deliver sort of a reality check. And we have some great experts, great speakers today. Eric Bratberg is director of the Europe program and a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington. He's an expert on European politics and security and transatlantic relations. Joan de Bardeleben is Chancellor's Professor and the Jean Monnet Chair of Politics and Society in Russia and the European Union at Carleton University in Ottawa. And Ambassador Dan Fried has had an absolutely storied career, over 40 years in the U.S. Foreign Service, where he's designed and implemented U.S. foreign policy in the wake of the fall of the Soviet Union under both Clinton and Bush administrations. He served as ambassador to Poland, where I was born. He's been Assistant Secretary of State for Europe. He's helped craft NATO enlargement to Central Europe, among many other things. He is currently the Weiser Family Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council, and he's also on the board of directors of the National Endowment for Democracy and a visiting professor at Warsaw University. So welcome, everybody. I'll just kick it off with a recent conversation that we had at Politico with an ambassador from one of the large European countries. He came to meet with our editors, and I asked him, what stories are we not covering at Politico that we should be, that you want to read? And he thought about it for a minute, and he said, I'd really like to read about what the Biden administration thinks about Europe. What does he think of Europe, the idea of Europe, the reality of Europe? And I said, be careful what you ask for, because I covered Canada-US relations for many years, and it reminds me of the line from The Fountainhead, where someone says to Howard Rourke, tell me what you really think of me. No one will hear us. And Rourke says, I don't think of you. So with that, Eric, what does the Biden administration think about Europe? What is it hoping to get from Europe? And how is that aspiration holding up against the first few months of reality?
Sure. Well, great to be with you. And thank you, Louisa. I think, and as we heard from Ambassador Reeker, I think the Biden administration couldn't be clearer that they really see the world through this lens of democracies and authoritarians. And in this regard, of course, Europe is a key pillar when it comes to the US strategy of pushing back against the rising authoritarianism of the likes of Russia and China. And I think the Biden administration feels like they've gone out of their ways to engage the Europeans, to not only repair the relationship from the Trump years, but also to rebuild it, to say all the right things about being supportive of NATO's Article 5, supportive of the European Union, really engaging diplomatically with the Europeans to try to bring them on to this agenda. And I think when you talk to the Biden world, you sort of get the sense, at least in recent months, that there is a little bit of a disappointment here in the sort of lukewarm European response in signing up to this agenda, especially from Berlin and Paris. Of course, the Europeans signed this investment agreement with China, or at least finished negotiating it very early on in the administration. They've been a bit reluctant to really call China out over human rights, or to, of course, Germany is continuing the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And I think in some ways, maybe this European reluctance is a bit understandable. I mean, the Trump impact really had a it's lasting impact on Europe. There's still concerns about the future of the US political system, concerns about some of the policies continuing under this administration when it comes to trade protectionism, for instance. But I think ultimately, this is a very short-sighted approach. I think the Biden administration really represents a chance to renew this transatlantic relationship. And I think despite maybe some of the slow start, I think this agenda is coming together. I think we saw that during the president's trip to Europe last month at the G7, NATO, and the EU-US summits. Really a lot of new initiatives on technology, on competing with the Belt and Road Initiative, on climate, on human rights. So I think it's coming together, but there's more work to be done. And I think beyond the sort of short term, what I really think the Biden administration offers an opportunity is to renew and help reframe the transatlantic relationship, where I think the U.S. should really be supportive of a strong Europe, a Europe that is capable, that can take responsibility, that can contribute. But at the same time, I think that also means that Europe should abandon this rhetoric about strategic autonomy that sort of sends the wrong message that Europe is somewhat wishy-washy between the US and China. It doesn't mean that it completely has to align itself all the time with Washington, but I think it means that it should see itself as a key player in a group of democracies that includes, of course, the US and Europe, but also includes Canada and the United Kingdom, or Australia and Japan, where the EU should seek to just take on a more of a leading role and see this framework as democracies coming together as the best opportunity for actually pushing back against China and Russia and actually competing with them from a position of strength, and actually as an opportunity to also avoid confrontation from those countries. So I think we're still in early days, and I think certainly the visit by Angela Merkel here in Washington today will be a key test to how well this new approach is coming together. But I think we've made some progress. There's more work to be done. And I think there's an opportunity now to reframe the transatlantic relationship, given this new view of the relationship that the Biden administration has taken.
Eric, what is your test? We'll see what comes out of this meeting. How will we know if this was a successful meeting or not?
I'm sure we will hear a lot of very positive rhetoric, and this is the sort of farewell tour by Angela Merkel, right? I don't expect to see very much on Nord Stream 2. She's made it very clear that she wants to continue this pipeline that is very disliked by the Biden administration and Capitol Hill here in Washington. I do hope that we'll see some positive rhetoric on China, because that's the one issue where Germany has been quite reluctant to sort of be vocal about calling China out. They very much want to continue the trade relationship with China. They are afraid about decoupling and the growing US-China rivalry. But I do think, again, because the importance of democracies coming together on this issue, I will look for some positive language suggesting that Germany is more willing to work with the US on addressing what ultimately are shared challenges stemming from China: economic, politically, human rights, and security.
Great. Well, Professor Bardeleben, I think we've heard this morning about the big challenges: COVID, climate change, democracy, human rights, the rules-based international order. You've been thinking about the opportunities and the challenges for transatlantic cooperation. Can you give us your top 2 or 3? And do you see evidence that we are seizing these opportunities, or what would it actually take to seize them?
Oh, thank you very much. And I'm really glad to join you here from Ottawa. My perspective on this would be that it's very important that the transatlantic relationship now focus on global issues. And we've heard a lot about the challenges and the differences, the potential conflicts and actual conflicts between democracies and authoritarian regimes, which of course have to be addressed. And it's certainly a high priority for Canada to stand by Ukraine, to call out the actions that Russia has taken in relation to Ukraine and other neighboring countries. Those are very high priorities. On the other hand, there's actually also a really big challenge in terms of the risks of an increasingly adversarial relationship between the Western democracies and countries like Russia and China. We shouldn't lose sight of the fact that we have a real security dilemma emerging in Europe and other parts of the world. And what this means is that our efforts to increase security often lead to a spiral of adversarial confrontation, because the responses, build on each other on both sides. And that kind of a dynamic, I think, really, we really need to focus on trying to interrupt that. And one way to do that is to try to identify areas of mutual interest that exist between the transatlantic partners and between other countries with whom we have a lot of tensions. Of course, one of these important areas is climate change. And I would put that actually very close to the top of my list as something that really needs to be assertively addressed and quickly. And we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that, as many speakers have already pointed out, this congruence of transatlantic commitment on issues like climate change, it's present now, but we don't know how long it will last. These things are subject to the fluctuations of electoral politics. In countries like the US, even in Canada, we're going to have an upcoming election, presumably quite soon. And although the current government, according to public opinion polls, seems poised to come out ahead, nothing is guaranteed in these kinds of situations. And so this congruence that we have on the issue of climate change, I think really has to be taken advantage of, and very quickly, because it's an issue that requires extremely assertive action. We have to consider that something like climate change has the potential to feed a whole bunch of other international conflicts: climate refugees, conflict over resource accessibility, not to mention the economic costs. So that would be one. And a second one that really hasn't been mentioned yet is the importance of combating the arms buildup, which is occurring. We're really beginning to see potentially the beginning of another arms race. And I'm really glad to see the Biden administration with the extension of the New START treaty opening the door to arms negotiations. But it's important that we not lose sight of the fact that we have to kind of capitalize on these areas of global concern to try to engage as well as confront challenges that are coming from authoritarian governments. So those would be the two at the top of my list. I'd also put cybersecurity issues quite high. I think that's very important. These can challenge critical infrastructure. These are common interests that all countries face, addressing cybersecurity challenges. And of course, nuclear nonproliferation is also very important.
Well, it's quite a list. Do you see progress on any of these? Is there one where we're actually delivering?
Well, I think on the climate change issue, this is a very encouraging time because we do see, as I mentioned, a congruence of commitment coming out of Washington, which of course was the key partner that was missing. And we see that the announcement yesterday from the EU. Canada also seems at the moment to be quite on track with this. And we have the Glasgow climate change meeting coming up later this year. So I think we can see a lot of encouragement there. There's a lot of more support coming from the US for multilateral organizations and multilateral initiatives, even if so far, for example, the engagement to try to get the Iranian agreement, the nuclear agreement back on track have not been that successful. At least there's an attempt. Support for other multilateral organizations is something where we're seeing a lot of progress as well. So I think those are key indicators because it's through multilateral organizations that we can address these global challenges. Really, when we talk about a rules-based international order, that has to be operationalized. And it gets operationalized through real multilateral initiatives, multilateral organizations like in trade, many of them are issue specific as well. The WTO, the IOM, the International Organization on Migration, the International Climate Change Agreement, the Arctic Council. We can go on and list these organizations. And it's great to see US support coming back strongly for these organizations. And I think it's when we try to build, real operational bases for not only transatlantic cooperation, but using the transatlantic partnership to strengthen these multilateral organizations, that we're likely to be able to try to, again, get that process of a rules-based international order back on track. So I think that's something Canada is very strong on in terms of multilateralism. And I think it's a very, very important element of support for this transatlantic agenda.
Well, to take it from there, Ambassador Freed, I want to ask you to put your Kremlinologist hat back on. If you're Vladimir Putin and you're watching the first few months of the Biden administration's relations with Europe, with Canada, with its allies, what's going through your head?
The Biden administration and the Europeans have offered Putin a pretty reasonable framework for relations. That is, cooperation where we can, and certainly trying to make the relationship more predictable and stable as the Americans, as President Biden offered Putin. Putin has no interest in stability or predictability because Putin's response to the Biden administration's careful and thoughtful overtures was to increase cyber attacks on the United States and to threaten Ukraine with a military buildup. And now Putin has personally written an article published under his name threatens Ukraine's territorial integrity by laying the basis for massive Russian territorial claims against its neighbor. So what's going through Putin's head is probably something like, I'm going to test this guy. The rules-based international order that favors freedom is something that the Biden administration was all behind. They're the most pro-European administration in a generation in Washington. They have none of the ambiguity about the European Union that even the Clinton and Obama administrations had. They like it. They're okay with working with the EU on regulations to deal with issues of cyber, to deal with slave labor in China. They're all about strengthening multilateral organizations, but to do so with a purpose. That's good. The problem is that Putin is an opponent in principle of the rules-based international order. He's made that clear. He hates it. He believes in Machtpolitik. And that's a problem. Now, we need to be able to deal with Putin where we have overlapping interests. I think that Biden was right to meet with Putin. A lot of critics said, no, you shouldn't do that. But I think he was right. I was the right call. But this is not simply getting in a circle and holding hands. It is strengthening the rules-based international order and working with Europe and Canada, the G7, to do so in order to deal and get real about the authoritarian rivals. Russia and China are not the same. Putin is aggressive, dangerous, and almost a nihilist. China is not like that. They gain a lot from the international order, but they also try to exploit and game it. And I like what Secretary Blinken said when he was challenged a few weeks ago on one of the American Sunday talk shows. He said, "Do you want a Cold War with China?" He said, "Of course not. I want to strengthen the international rules so that China plays according to these rules and is unable to game them," which I think was just the right answer. And it is one also designed to capture a maximum of European support. And one other point, look, I've dealt for years and years with extravagant European, especially French rhetoric about an autonomous Europe. It doesn't bother me. If that's the price to pay for Europe actually bringing more to the table, I'll take it. I'll take it and say thank you if they do bring things to the table. What I don't want is a kind of, pointless posturing about equidistancing themselves between the United States and China. What they should do is bring more to the table and then work with the US. And help work with us so that what we propose is informed by European advice in advance. The Americans have a bad habit of announcing initiatives and then pushing the Europeans to agree. We really ought to be better at discussing them with the Europeans quietly and seeing what works. I think this administration is more apt to do it. Anyway, that's a lot. And I know I took advantage of you and went well beyond the Russia question, but I wanted the good European stuff.
I think you've hit on a really interesting point that I wanted to raise in this conversation, which, I grew up in Western Canada in the 1980s. And I remember sitting in my classroom getting a handout from my social studies teacher. And I'm not making this up. It had a picture of Canada in the middle of a sandwich. And this was the nuclear sandwich. And we were sort of the salami in between the United States and the Soviet Union. And, that image came back to me as we talk about the rise of China and we talk about allies being caught in the middle between their desire to have economic relations with China, to sell Canadian agricultural products to China, for the Europeans to have an investment relationship with China. At the same time, the United States, is trying to distance itself, trying to put pressure on China, trying to cabin China, trying to control what they're doing in intellectual property and in various strategic industries. So from you, where you sit, how should allies like Canada and the European Union navigate this new rising rivalry? I mean, that is obviously the fundamental question here, but how do you think about it?
Carrying out, look, I think the Biden administration's framework for working with Europe and working with Canada and the core democracies is just right. Of course, implementation is going to be hard. Oh my God. Once you get past the rhetoric and start to try to implement everything that was agreed to in the Biden trip to Europe, that's where the trouble will come. The fact is, we cannot simply declare a cold economic war with China and freeze them out. But we equally cannot let the Chinese continue to exploit and game the system and not play by any rules, which means it comes down to seizing the high ground of regulation and enforcement of rules in intellectual property, restricting use of slave labor so that the upstream supply chains are not infected by the gulag the Chinese are setting up with the Uyghurs. But this doesn't mean you start forcing other countries to commit economic suicide, nor are we going to do so ourselves. It means working at the margins, chipping away, and always working on regulatory issues consistent with our own deeper values and the rule of law. Now, somebody's going to say, well, that sounds nice, but it's going to be hard. Yeah, it always is, right? It always is. But if you start out in the right direction, then the compromises, detours, half measures, and wrangling that is inevitable will point you in the right direction. And that's why I'm so hopeful about the Biden administration, especially after the Trump years, because Trump didn't want to get along with Europe. He hated the idea of the European Union in principle, which is a bad basis for trying to get along with them. A final point. Look, there's this kind of mythology that the European Commission is this bureaucratic monster and it overregulates and it's terrible. And people have sort of internalized the language that Boris Johnson used when he was a journalist and making the stuff up about the European Commission. I work closely with the Commission. Yeah, they can be tough when they're on the opposite side. But frankly, I found that very often they think in broad strategic terms like Americans rather than more national terms. Look at the Russia paper, the Russia policy paper that the European External Action Service and the Commission just put out and that the European leaders more or less adopted. It's a terrific piece of work, strong, clear, fits easily with the Biden-Russia approach. It's a strong paper. There's nothing wrong with working with the Commission. And we should be prepared to do so because we may find out in a lot of areas, they're our natural friends, especially if we're not charging up the old hill of a free trade area and stimulating all of the opponents. Let's work on regulatory reform, anti-corruption, financial transparency, cyber regulation, counter disinformation regulation, where the European Union is way ahead of the Americans. I'm optimistic, tempered by hard experience. Anyway, quite enough for me. And thank you for the questions.
All right. I have one quick question for Eric Bratberg before we turn to some audience questions. I think Doug Saunders mentioned really important issue, multilateralism politically, but then unilateral trade policy. The previous US administration obviously launched a trade war with China, had trade spats with Europe, forced a renegotiation of NAFTA. Biden is not launching a trade war, but the way he talks and his administration thinks about the strategic rivalry with China, there's a big component of strategic industrial policy. And they talk about reshoring key supply chains as not just an economic issue, but a security issue. Now, I've heard words in Canada and elsewhere like ally shoring or Buy North America, talking about trying to broaden the conception of what is a strategic industrial policy. From what you see, Eric, is that just a mirage? How should allies be thinking about the current economic mindset of this administration? We heard the ambassador earlier say, give it some time, but what are we actually waiting for here?
Yeah, I think it's clear that the Biden administration is not going to have a very ambitious free trade agenda as such. Certainly no going back to negotiating a transatlantic comprehensive free trade agreement. And I think we have yet to see exactly what its own trade policy towards China will be, whether it will keep phase one or try to renegotiate it. So there are a lot of uncertainties still. But I think broadly speaking, there's been a lot of convergence, even in recent years, and I think that continues to be the case, between the European and the US view of China constituting at least an economic challenge and a strategic challenge. And I think that provides a lot to build on. And I think this notion that we need to invest more in our own economies and our own industrial policies, I don't think is necessarily problematic, as long as it's aligned and as long as it's coordinated. I think we should aim to be more competitive with the Chinese, and that does require investing more at home in our innovation base, in our R&D, in our technology. But it doesn't mean necessarily that it's going to look the same on both sides of the Atlantic, but it needs to be, broadly speaking, needs to be aligned. And by the way, the Europeans are doing this too. They are not necessarily reshoring or decoupling, but they're certainly diversifying their dependence on China. And they learned that lesson from COVID, for instance, with medical supplies being so reliant on China. So I think as far as the transatlantic allies, including Canada and others, Japan, G7, are able to do this together, setting shared standards on AI and other emerging technologies, creating opportunities for research and scientific cooperation, and making sure that this does not become a slippery slope for protectionism, I think it's fine. I think it's actually a good thing. And we saw at the G7 and the EU-US summit, some of these new initiatives now being launched, such as this new Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council, that potentially could be really significant now in having the formats for being able to do some of this regulatory work that Ambassador Fried spoke about. So I'm hopeful that this could be an opportunity to avoid protectionism and avoid each side doing their own thing and actually coming together on kind of a shared transatlantic competitiveness and resilience agenda, which is ultimately what we need to compete with China.
All right, that sounds very appealing. I guess we'll see. We are going to turn to audience questions. And our first question today comes from the Canadian ambassador to Russia, Alison Leclerc, and she'll be asking a question over video. So we're going to go to her now.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for a really fascinating conversation and for giving me the chance to ask a question. As you said, Louisa, I'm sitting here in Moscow, so unsurprisingly, my question is going to relate to Russia and perhaps maybe most appropriately directed to Ambassador Fried. In talking about transatlantic, strengthening the transatlantic community, there's discussion also about where and how we engage with Russia. Here, Russia just published its updated national security strategy. And in looking at it, most experts really see a document that is upping the threat level, upping the tension level, and together with what we've seen on the domestic front here over the past year, really reducing space for engagement, either at the diplomatic level or at the level of people-to-people engagement, science, culture, because this perception that if it's foreign, it's a foreign agent or it's an extremist. So the shrinking space for that kind of routine engagement. So I'm interested in hearing your thoughts. Do you agree with that assessment? Do you see it more for domestic political purposes and short-term in nature? Do you see it as part of an enduring trend? And if so, what are the opportunities for maintaining those bridges? Thank you.
I share your assessment. I wish I could argue with you that it was better, but I think you nailed it. I think that as long as Putin is in power, we're going to be dealing with increasing levels of repression at home, which recall many of the Soviet tactics that I remember from, being a student in the 1970s and living in Moscow and a young diplomat in the early 1980s. We're going to be dealing with this because Putin has defined his interests in ways that none of us can accept. He demands a right to engage in repression at home and aggression abroad against the countries that he regards as within Moscow's sphere of domination, such as Ukraine and Belarus. And the trouble is that the Ukrainians, and now it seems the Belarusians, have other ideas. So it is not inherently stable. That said, I think the US and Europe have separately come up with the outlines of a policy which is sustainable, which is push back against Russian aggression, strengthen our own resilience to deal with Russian aggression against us, engage with Russia in areas of common interest. I mean, don't hesitate to do it. Arms control. I'm glad the Biden administration extended New START. I'm all for it. And a fourth pillar of reaching out to the Russian people. Putin doesn't like that. And I don't really care because as we discovered during the Cold War, the Kremlin and the Russian people are not always the same thing. And I'm not one of these American Russia hands who thinks that Russians are incapable of producing any kind of political system other than Putinism. I don't think so. And we need to reach out to the Russian people, anything from exchanges but also ways to penetrate the tightening wall of censorship and control. So this is not going to be easy. But I also remember the early 1980s when there were concerns in Europe about war breaking out and that crazy man, Ronald Reagan, and confrontation with the Soviets, a lot of concerns. And yet, as we discovered, there was a better future waiting in the wings. That may be the case this time. So it is not going to be easy. But I think the US, Europe, UK, G7 have the outlines of the sustainable approach involving the elements I've mentioned.
Thank you so much, ambassadors. We have a regional question from the audience, which I'd like to direct to Professor Bardeleben. Two sort of linked questions. I'll let you figure out how to address them. The first is, what is the future of relations between Canada, the United States, the EU, and Romania? And the second is, how do the member states of NATO think about Ukraine and Georgia? So just take us to that region and maybe give us your take there.
Well, of course, Romania is a member of the European Union. So that there, I think it's quite clear that the basis of the EU's relationship with Romania is as a member state, and I don't see any change occurring in that regard. Likewise, I think that the main vehicle through which, I don't know too much, honestly, about bilateral US-Romanian relations or Canadian bilateral Romanian relations, but that as a member of the European Union, that Romania would be, of course, the beneficiaries of any agreements that occur between the European Union and the US or Canada, including, for example, the trade agreement, the Canada-EU trade agreement, which was signed in 2016. So I don't see any particularly problematic aspects of that relationship. As regards Ukraine and Georgia, I think it's quite clear what the NATO position is on those countries. I mean, Georgia, the 2008 conflict in Georgia between Russia and Georgia over the separatist regions is now there's an EU monitoring mission there, which is quite modest. NATO doesn't have a particular involvement there, but of course these are countries that aspire at least on and off to NATO membership. And I don't think that's something that's on the horizon in the near future for a variety of reasons. I think, for one thing, it would impose considerable obligations on NATO if those countries were to become members, because Article 5 would then apply. And despite the commitment to those countries, I'm not sure that's a commitment that NATO is willing to take on. There's also considerable division within NATO over whether those countries should be admitted. And it would be to Russia quite a provocation. And I think many European countries would therefore be quite hesitant to go down that path. I think that Mr. Putin has made it quite clear that NATO membership for either one of those countries would be a red line, and it would up the tension quite a lot. Now, that's not to say that should be the determining factor, but I think it is certainly a consideration for many of the European NATO members. And there's also a question of whether this would actually promote peace and security in Europe. I think in my view, countries like Ukraine, particularly, the optimal outcome is that they can have very positive relationships with the European Union, with the United States, with Canada, but also a reasonably good relationship with Russia. I think this is in the long-term interest of the region. How we get there is a more difficult question. Maybe the Normandy format, where France and Germany continue to take the lead in terms of those discussions, the continuing discussion about the Minsk protocols and whether there's any way to actually bring their achievement. It seems rather difficult. They're finding alternatives to that. But I'm not sure the path of sort of an increased tension in the region through NATO membership would necessarily stabilize the situation. I don't foresee that happening in any foreseeable future. However, of course, NATO stands behind the Ukrainians in terms of their current situation of having had their territorial integrity violated by Russia. So I'd say it's a kind of a commitment, but one that does not involve at this point in time the prospect of NATO membership for those countries.
And we have a final audience question, which I'm going to riff on a little bit. Someone is asking, what concretely can the transatlantic alliance do to contribute to decreasing tension in adversarial relations with countries like Russia and China? And I would say, are the people of these countries actually in agreement that that is a goal? I'm looking at the US, where former Vice President Mike Pence gave a speech yesterday saying that the American response is weak to China, that China senses this weakness and that weakness arouses evil. And he called for more urgent steps like a trade agreement with Taiwan, decoupling the US economy from China, et cetera. Canada's moving into an election campaign, and the Trudeau administration's response to China in the wake of the arrest of 2 Canadians, has been very debated internally in Canada. So maybe I'll throw to you, Eric. What can these countries do to decrease tensions, but also do they want to, given their own domestic politics?
I think it's fair to say that maybe in the US there is a rising sort of anti-China sentiments on some parts of maybe the political right, but I don't think that's reflected in Europe and maybe elsewhere in the transatlantic relationship. I don't think
opinion polls in Canada I've seen huge swings regarding
and I think Europeans are becoming more skeptical of China, but I think they still are very reluctant to become part of sort of taking sides in a U.S.-China sort of Cold War 2.0. They want to avoid that. They want to continue to engage China. I think what we should do is, what Ambassador Fried spoke about, which is really coming together as a collective democratic community and shaping the international norm, strengthening the international order, not to necessarily just confront China and Russia, but to sort of give them a choice. They can actually buy into this and play by the rules, and tensions will be reduced. I think that's a far better strategy than just being confrontational for the point of being confrontational, which was very much the strategy of the previous administration. And that's why I hope that this new approach of trying to bring countries together, rally democracies, can actually achieve better results and avoid confrontation. And I think Europeans should actually sign up for that and be willing to join that. But of course, the jury's still out on how this is going to turn out. But in my view, that's a far better strategy for how to go about this.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador Fried, you're nodding your head. Quick final word from you, perhaps?
Agree completely. The issue, as a matter of diplomatic tactics, a confrontational U.S. approach that leads with a hard edge is not going to capture the kind of European-Canadian support we need. An approach rooted in a rules-based international order is apt to actually be more effective dealing with China. It's more sustainable politically, which is what we need. No, in diplomacy, you have to put out papers not only for their effect in Congress and public domestic opinion, but sustainability and actual results. You can do more by being judicious, and I think Eric nailed it.
And Professor Varleben, final last thought from you before we pass the baton to the next panel.
Well, just addressing rather Russia, because I think the question was asking about both countries rather than China. I think important is, to the extent possible, to tone down the rhetoric. Although the rhetoric is coming strong and fast sometimes from the Russian side, that it's best to maintain a less inflamed rhetorical response at points. And I think the Europeans, in their policy toward Russia, what they've defined as the 5 steps in their relations with Russia, can be a good guidance, which lay out that finding areas of cooperation of mutual benefit, mutual interest. However, those mutual interests have to be defined, and that's really the key thing, is for the transatlantic partners to define where engagement with Russia can be of mutual benefit to both to the West as well as to Russia, and then working hard in those areas. And that takes me back to some of the areas I talked about at the beginning, like climate change, with the work of Canada in the Arctic Council with Russia has been at times quite constructive. And so these are areas where, if in these particular sectoral areas, if there can be gains made, also the health issue, the pandemic, the preventing future pandemics or trying to have an early warning system. These kinds of things are areas where you can tone down the level of the adversarial interactions if you can find areas of particular sectoral policy mutual interest and work on those. And these are, sometimes called small steps, the small steps approach. And it does offer some potential, I think, to try to reestablish some level of engagement without compromising on those key values that we're so strong on, like territorial integrity, human rights, and some of the other things we've been talking about.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Thank you to all of our panelists and to our very engaged audience and to the Atlantic Council for bringing us all together. I'm going to now turn the Zoom floor over to the Atlantic Council's Ben Judah, who will host the next conversation in the series.
Thank you so much. That's a real pleasure to be joining everyone here today. And I'm really looking forward to moderating this fantastic conversation in our next panel. The topic we're going to be discussing now is engaging democracies in Asia and beyond, and we've got a star-studded cast for you. So I'd like to first introduce Sophia Gaston, Director of the British Foreign Policy Group. Welcome, Sophia. I'd like to introduce our own Ash Jain, Director for Democratic Order at the Scowcroft Centre for Strategy and Security here at the Atlantic Council, and of course, formerly of State Department Policy Planning. And I'm last but not least, I'm thrilled to be introducing Mr. Jonathan Berkshire Miller, Director and Senior Fellow at the Indo-Pacific Program at the Macdonald Laurier Institute. So thank you so much all for joining me here today. Let me just give you a very quick run of show. If you're in the audience, halfway through, we'll be transitioning from my moderated questions to your audience questions. So please throw them in the Q&A box. Don't be shy. So I'd love to kind of begin now by asking each of our panelists a kind of opening question that will give everyone a chance to speak for kind of 3 or 4 minutes and give their opening remarks. So I'd like to begin in Canada with Jonathan. So my question for you, Jonathan, is, does Canada have a unique role to play in building new partnerships, given its status as both a transatlantic and a trans-Pacific nation?
Well, thank you so much, Ben, for having me, and for the Atlantic Council and Global Affairs Canada for convening this really important discussion. I really enjoyed the first panel, and I think it's a really important question, and one, Ben, that frankly we get a lot here in Canada. And one of the questions we often get is one of resources. Canada is both an Atlantic nation and a Pacific nation. But with the challenges, obviously, of the rise of China, some of the beneficial elements of that, but some of the difficulties that we're now facing in that relationship, how do we balance from a resources perspective and from an interest perspective some of these interests, both in the Atlantic side and in the Pacific side? My answer is that we have to do both. It's not an either or situation. And I think this goes into the strategic rationale of why we need to be engaging much more closely with other states in the Indo-Pacific. So one of the things, and I think it's great that we're doing this in a sort of a transatlantic discussion today, is our European friends are a little bit of ahead of Canada now on thinking about the Indo-Pacific. And when I say Asia, I don't fundamentally mean or focus the discussion on the challenges with China. I think this is one of the difficulties in having this discussion about engaging more deeply with countries in the Indo-Pacific, is so often it's framed around the strategic competition with the United States, or some of the, in Canada's context now, the current challenges, many of them have been alluded to already today, whether it's the two Michaels that are detained. 5G obviously is a controversial decision now happening in Canada as well, in the future of next generation networks. But the China relationship is just one element of how we engage with the Indo-Pacific. And I think one of the things that we can learn very closely from our European friends, as I said, we've seen the Dutch now, the Germans, the French, the UK have their own sort of in their defense integrated strategy review, quite a robust discussion on the Indo-Pacific. We can learn that we have equities and we can have a strategy in the Indo-Pacific that is not seen necessarily as a punitive measure because of the recent tensions in our relationship with China. So I think that is the sort of strategic rationale, I would say, on how and why we need to be working much more closely with our European friends and frankly also our American friends. So this is another thing I push back on here in Canada, is it's not that we are stuck in between the US and China and we're a neutral party. Clearly, we don't agree with everything that the United States does in foreign policy terms and even on China. But the fact remains that the United States is our only border, our most critical ally. And on many issues, including on China, we have a lot of convergences. So I think that's an important point too. And the last thing that I'll note, and maybe I can get into a little bit more of Canada's role in the region later, but the last thing I'd like to note is as important as the why is the how. And often I'll refer to this as vehicles of engagement. So today, obviously, we've spent a lot of time talking about multilateral vehicles, whether that's NATO, and NATO also is starting to reform its thinking on China and some of the challenges on China. But I think we need to be a bit more creative on thinking on some of these vehicles of engagement. In addition to the multilateral, in addition to the bilateral, I think what we're seeing happening in the Indo-Pacific is a growth of minilateralism as well. And this doesn't mean that, the Quad, for example, between the US, Japan, India, and Australia is going to take over NATO or become an Asian NATO. But it means that Asia lacks the sort of infrastructure that the transatlantic community has had for so many years. So we need to be thinking about pluses, complementary bodies. And I think this is something where Canada can contribute. Not just working, for example, through the ASEAN Regional Forum, through the G7 and other sort of bodies, but looking more and more at minilateral opportunities with like-minded partners. So I'll leave it there for now, but happy to come back on these issues later.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'd now like to skip and hop across the Atlantic to Sophia Gaston in London. And I'd like to ask you this question, Sophia. Given the challenges stemming from China, how can the transatlantic community engage more effectively with other democratic partners in the Indo-Pacific to address these global challenges?
Well, a great question. And thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be joining you. And hopefully it won't be too much longer until we can get that air corridor happening and bridge that Atlantic once more. I think, look, obviously this Indo-Pacific tilt, as it's described in Integrated Review, is a subject of huge focus and attention in Whitehall at the moment. I think I'll just run through a couple of the ways in which the conversation is sort of playing out, because as has been noted, we did publish this Integrated Review was published in March. And so now we're moving into the kind of early phases of the implementation phase of that review. And that's when we really get into the weeds of some of the difficult questions and prioritization and choices. Not least of all, there's also a money conversation running along in the background. So I guess the kind of 5 areas in which the tilt is being explored at the moment, in terms of how we actually put the meat on the bones of this ambition. It's obviously starting through an economic lens. So we are trying to join the CPTPP. We've applied for that. We're quite keen to deepen our roots in a number of different kind of economic forums. There's a lot of work being done on how to boost particularly research and development and scientific cooperation. There's also the question about security. So as has been mentioned, the Quad, I think there is a fundamental question for Britain about whether or not we would want to be a plus in that kind of activity. Then there's the values agenda. So I think one of the things that we're struggling with a little bit at the moment and haven't quite come out the other side on is this question about how we engage with partners in the region with whom we might share some interests, some principles, but it might be a kind of form of economic openness rather than what we would constitute an open
characterized as an open society or certainly a democracy. So I think trying to wade through some of those questions. There's also a lot of work being done on climate action, diversity, of course, in the lead up to our hosting of COP26 in November. The two other kind of areas that I think there's a lot of discussion about at the moment is firstly, this question of governance. I think many of the new kind of frontiers of governance at the moment, whether that's sort of space regulation, AI, ethics, the open internet, and so on, a lot of those are going to have touch points with partners in the Indo-Pacific. And a lot of those conversations are also going to sort of I think in a way there's something that Britain feels that we have a kind of particular expertise and capability in leading those conversations. So I think in a way almost, we obviously, there's been a lot of attention on our aircraft carrier, which is kind of moving in towards the South China Sea at the moment. I think that's as much as security sort of a kind of a demonstration of our interest in the region's security as it is about trying to get into those governance questions, because of course freedom of navigation is something that we do feel we have a particular role to play in. And then I think the final area that we're kind of really trying to tease out at the moment is these questions about the projection of our soft power in the Indo-Pacific region. China has obviously been cracking down on and expelling a lot of Western journalists. They have, after the Chinese state broadcaster had its license revoked in the UK, they've retaliated by banning the World Service from broadcasting in China. So we are just starting to have a lot of these conversations where perhaps we hadn't been quite appreciating the reach and influence that we were able to have through our media operations and through a lot of other different channels there. So the integrated review, I mean, I think there's the substance of it is that we've essentially set out an ambition to become the leading European power in the Indo-Pacific. But at the same time, we also say that we will only lead where it makes sense for us to do so. So there's sort of an interesting nuance there. I think there's a fundamental question about how we prioritize risks. And a lot of the conversations inevitably come down to resources. It is just a fact that government finances are not in the best shape at the moment, that really difficult decisions are having to be made. But, also that the integrated review makes clear that the European regional security framework will remain our fundamental kind of security paradigm. But just inevitably, if we are going to be moving resources into a new area, I don't think we have a choice about that. I think we have to be playing in that region. But of course, those resources are going to have to come from somewhere else. So I think, a lot of that really difficult legwork on prioritizing our capabilities is taking place. So, I mean, just to finish, I think I do think that, like as has been set out with Canada, I think our interest in the Indo-Pacific region are not entirely about recalibrating our relationship with China, but certainly they are, a lot of them are indirectly, if not challenging China specifically, challenging some of the issues that are arising from the kind of increasing influence of authoritarian states. And so I think, we have to consider that the UK-China relationship, which is in a state of flux at the moment, is never really entirely bilateral. It's also going to be about the relationships that we hold with our other partners, Western allies, and new kind of other liberal partners that we're seeking to kind of build those relationships within the Indo-Pacific. So I think what's going to be really crucial for the UK is that we need to make sure there's a degree of kind of strategic consistency between the bilateral relationship and our new ambitions for the Indo-Pacific. So we'll see. As I say, we're in kind of early stages of this, so it's still all to play for at the moment. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sophia. I'd now like to jump to our own Ash Jain with a question. Are there new formats for multilateral cooperation among democracies, including those in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, that should be considered?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Ben. It's been great to hear the discussion so far this morning, and delighted to join you all on this panel. So in answering your question, I think it's important to remind everyone of the context that Ambassador Reeker highlighted in his remarks, that for the first time in more than 3 decades, the democratic world is facing a systemic challenge from autocratic rivals, particularly China and Russia, that are seeking to displace or disrupt the rules-based international order. And transatlantic cooperation has primarily been facilitated through institutions like NATO and the G7 over the past decades. It's becoming clear now that today's challenges are going to require much better coordination across the Atlantic and the Pacific. And that's because democracies in the Asia-Pacific region, like Japan and Australia, South Korea, others, have an essential role in defending the rules-based system in an era where Asia is just bigger and more powerful economically and politically than it has been in the past. So to position themselves to succeed in this new era, we're going to need to develop and adapt the institutions that we have had in place really since the end of World War II and make them fit for purpose for today's challenges. I'd like to suggest that we consider at least 3 new types of institutions or entities that help reflect this new reality. The first is what has already been mentioned earlier, this idea of a D10, a group of leading democracies along the lines that Prime Minister Johnson has proposed this past month when he organized the G7 summit, and the goal of which is to foster strategic alignment, coordinated action, particularly on the challenges of Russia and China. The D10 would bring together a group of nations that are strategically like-minded and that have demonstrated a capacity for global influence. So that would mean that both bringing the G7, existing G7 partners together, as well as Australia and South Korea. Of course, the EU is already a member. Perhaps over time, India could be brought in as well if like-mindedness concerns could be overcome. But the idea is to foster this new kind of powerful group of influential democracies to try to set the strategic framework for cooperation across Asia, Europe, and North America. Second, we should look into forming a democratic technology alliance to ensure that the free world succeeds in the race for emerging technologies such as AI, genetic engineering, robotics, quantum computing. Some small groupings have been formed to focus on some of these challenges, but the idea of an alliance kind of structured around a strategic agenda could advance cooperation on technology and to ensure that norms and standards are developed consistent with liberal values, rather than letting others, autocracies, China, seek to lead the way and form their own rules. And finally, we should consider creating a new kind of free trade or trade agreement that would align the world's democracies in a common framework to advance a free and fair global economy. Sophia mentioned Britain's interest in joining the CPP, or what was once the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And that could be an important step towards creating a broader trade agreement that knits together the transatlantic and the trans-Pacific. The idea is to ratchet down trade barriers and also to make democracies less economically dependent on rival autocratic powers while stimulating economic engagement and just free and open trade more generally without regard to kind of artificial divisions along regional lines. Finally, I just wanted to note a special role that transatlantic allies will have in creating the new architecture for today's era. Britain, post-Brexit, has already taken the lead in kind of putting some of these ideas on the table for democratic coordination. As I said, promoting the D10 concept, joining the CPP. And so certainly the British will have a key role in driving these ideas forward. But of course, none of these concepts can materialize without active US support. And for the Biden administration, entities like this could provide a new paradigm for American leadership, treating democratic allies as core partners in shaping a global order that reflects shared interests and values. Germany will soon have a new chancellor, and it's going to play an important role, especially as it hosts the G7 next year. And finally, Canada could be instrumental, given its past legacy in establishing multilateral entities. It was a founding member of NATO. It conceptualized the G20 earlier on. It's played a key role in some of the Track 2 efforts on the D10. So as both a transatlantic and trans-Pacific power, Canada can serve as a bridge to connect the two regions and shape some of these new entities. So the bottom line really is that as we're entering this era of strategic competition, the US and transatlantic allies need to be prepared to take dramatic steps to meet current challenges. It's no longer a world centered on the transatlantic. We need to bring in Asian democracies and ultimately even other democracies worldwide if we're going to succeed. And I look forward to talking more about these ideas in the discussion. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to now we're entering a new phase in the panel where I'm going to use my moderator's privilege to ask each of you a question and sort of look at this from a few angles. I'm going to come to you, Sophia, first with the question. What have we learned from the G7 that the UK hosted in sunny Cornwall about how effective Britain and the alliance has been in engaging democracies in Asia and beyond? What's your sort of review of the G7?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, you couldn't have had higher stakes. It was sort of the launch of Britain's Global Britain project, our kind of first big moment on the world stage after we've formally left the European Union. It was, obviously Biden's first kind of big trip. It was the first G7 since the pandemic and since Donald Trump and all the instability there's been in the Western Alliance during that time. So I think, the G7 format itself was also kind of on the table. It was being tested, and I think, in a way, all the key parties performed pretty well against their objectives. There were some genuine wins on the board, but I think what was quite clear for me from that experiences is that the D10 idea, which is now sort of also being discussed as a D11, and there's still a lot of ambiguity about its potential composition, but that it really sort of was off the table ultimately because there was just too much that needed to be addressed. And through the focus of the G7, there was a really low risk appetite for potentially destabilizing that. And ultimately, the idea of kind of just securing the future of the G7 format, which I think everybody there agreed was essential, that in the end just sort of obscured the capacity to kind of look beyond. And, I think it's disappointing on one level, but I think it was an interesting test of the concept because we did actually get to see some of the potential. So you could see areas of consensus forming, particularly a baseline view on China's particular threats to democratic values, human rights, and so on. You did see a coming together, which I'm sure the presence of countries like Australia and South Korea really helped push that along. But equally, you did also see some of the limitations. So the propensity for minilateralism, the challenges of the kind of individual bilateral relationships between the other countries, including some of the host nation invited guests. So obviously, the more you expand these kinds of alliances, you have the capacity to build consensus in ways that you couldn't through the traditional G7 format, but you also have the capacity for greater instability and obstacles to consensus. Countries like Australia, for example, are in quite a different state of their climate action transition to countries like Britain. So, including them might be helpful for coming to an agreement on China while also highlighting those kind of other areas where we still can't come to a common position yet amongst Western allies. So I think, I don't think that anyone who is very much an advocate for the D10 idea should be kind of dismayed by what we saw at the G7. I think it just highlighted the enormous to-do list that is facing Western and liberal allies, and just how much we really need to get the house back in order. The problem, of course, is that something like the D10 is trying to address longer-term structural problems, which are also really crucial. So I think that question of how we build bandwidth into the liberal alliance is going to be really essential.
Thank you so much. My next question is for Jonathan, and which is, there's been talk in Canada previously that expanding the G7 could be a risk to Canada's privileged access to other kind of world powers, or even lead to the diminution of Canada as a global power. I'd just like to get your sense on that debate now.
Yeah, well, I think it's a fair discussion that has been playing out a bit in Canada, and I would agree with a lot of Sophia's comments. My takeaway largely, and I think this has been a lot of the sentiment here in Canada. Two things that coming out of the G7 that I noticed. One was I would agree that this big sort of blue sky idea of the G10. Again, while the nuts and bolts of that, there's a lot of interesting elements of that, and I think there were a lot of interesting convergences. What I think that the G7 summit highlighted with the inclusion of the other three was just some of the divergences, particularly on some of the political issues. And I think a lot of that was driven by some of these internal disputes, a lot of the bilateral challenges between some of the members. I think that was highlighted. That being said, though, one thing that I think was very beneficial. So I think this was noticed by the Canadian side as well. One thing that was very beneficial to the G7, and again, it was a fairly low bar if you look at some of the challenges that I think the G7 and frankly many multilateral meetings have had the past several years, I think, especially dealing with the administration in Washington, is that there was a lot of robust agreement on a range of different issues, and particularly on the Indo-Pacific and on China. If you read the G7 foreign ministers communique and then the leaders statement, I mean, there is some relatively, I don't want to use unprecedented, but some very significant united language, whether it's on Taiwan and the stability in the Taiwan Straits, whether it's on their common agreement on shared challenges in the Indo-Pacific. Again, if you think back a few years ago, even using the Indo-Pacific word was seen as a sort of equaling containment of China. So the idea that the countries were able to agree on these issues was very, very significant. So I think generally, Canada is supportive of having observers join and sharing their opinions. But I think I would agree with Sophia that the consensus was that we're not quite there yet on reforming the G7 as a G10.
Thank you. And now my question is for Ash, which is looking at Southeast Asia and the frontline states in competition between the United States and China. One notices a distinct lack of democracies in a certain part of the world, looking at countries like Vietnam or fragile democracies or democracies in transition. Does that mean that the democratic frame is going to have to come second in building alliances against China? What kind of conversation should we be having in Washington about that? Or should we put the democratic frame first, regardless of the political nature of regimes in sort of Laos or in Vietnam or sort of Cambodia or elsewhere?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's not an easy one to address, because the fact is, as you said, the world consists of countries that are non-democratic, that are important geographically, strategically, and we have to be prepared to engage with a broad range of countries that share the same interests, that are share the same concerns, particularly about China and China's influence in the region. But what I'd say to that is that the core of a strategy still needs to be formulated among like-minded democracies. And that means that whether it's the G7 or an expanded G7, it's really incumbent on the leading democracies of the world to come together to formulate an approach in which they all agree would be both practical, realistic, and hopefully make a difference in terms of standing up to China's challenges to the rules-based system. Once there's an agreed framework on a strategy, it's then important. And this is where I think we do need to have an approach that doesn't just isolate other countries that don't necessarily share the same governance values. So that means reaching out to and partnering with countries like Vietnam, Singapore, others in the region that have concerns about what's happening, that are positioned to help advance some of the shared goals that we would have, whether it's with regard to China or other challenges. So I don't think it's either or. I think it's more beneficial to think about it in terms of layers or approaches of focus. And so building a core strategy and a core consensus among the leading democracies is the starting point, building then an approach that builds on the capabilities of others across the world, democracies or non-democracies, who are willing to partner and who share the same concerns. That's where we should take that approach next. So I guess that's what I would see as a sustainable framework.
Thank you. So now we're transitioning to audience questions. So don't be shy, throw your questions into the Q&A box. And the first question we have from Leslie Ray Rotor is, why is there no coordinated response by transatlantic allies regarding China's arbitrary detention of the two Michaels, who are, of course, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig? You know, an issue that is, of course, well known, especially in the think tank community. So, maybe Jonathan, you'd like to sort of have a go at that question.
Sure. Well, it's a really good question. And I would, push back a little bit and say, I think there has been this has been one example where I think the transatlantic community in particular has come together quite closely. Several members of NATO and obviously our US friends have signed the Declaration on Arbitrary Detention that Canada put forward. And in addition to this, actually, when Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor had their trials recently in China, unfortunately, our diplomatic officials weren't allowed to go in and observe those trials. But we had the presence of the diplomatic community, a heavy presence from the diplomatic community in NATO and the transatlantic communities that were right outside those court hearings next to officials from our Canadian mission in Beijing to lend their support. And I believe actually, whether it was the deputy head of mission or lower in the United States Embassy in Beijing, also was there and made short remarks about how they stand shoulder to shoulder with Canada on this. So very much, I think the transatlantic community actually has been standing together on this. And the last thing I would note on this is this issue of whether it's hostage diplomacy or arbitrary detention. This is not a unique issue in the Canada-China relationship. This is something our Japanese friends share. This is something Australian colleagues have had challenges with detentions in China, as well as some of our European friends. So this is very much a global issue and one that is not unique to China. I think that the idea of pushing back on this and making sure that this is not an acceptable tool of diplomacy is very, very important.
Thank you. So I've got another kind of question coming in, which is, do the panelists believe that we are entering a Cold War with China? So maybe Sophia, you'd like to answer that question.
Well, look, it's really difficult. The first thing I would say on this is that applying any kind of historical framework to China's behavior, its strategic intent, and our relations with China is probably going to be unhelpful. I think it's absolutely fair to say that advanced democracies in general, are facing existential threats on a number of levels. And I think that the question about whether it's a Cold War with China, firstly, I think that downplays the multiplicity of threats, which, are kind of expanding, fragmenting, across a number of different regions and extend certainly beyond China and its interests. But secondly, I think that also, very much is constituted by our own choice in our behaviors with China. I think some of the language, we've all been through reckonings about China, which I think are important to have. I think it's really absolutely essential that we have gone through this process of appreciating the systemic nature of the risk that it poses to the future of the liberal world order and to our own interests as democracies, and just how varied and complex those risks are, and that we're going through processes of building in safeguards. But equally, I think that it's true that over the past few years we've seen the rhetoric around our relationships with China sometimes move to quite dangerous points that I don't think are really helpful for anybody. So, I think we just have to strike the right balance between making sure that we're protecting ourselves and also not actually actively contributing to a destabilizing of the kind of, security framework that we're living in. And so, I think it's unhelpful to use the terminology of the Cold War, but I do think it's important for us to take seriously that these threats are existential. It's just that they are not solely contained within China and the boundaries of its interests. It's actually something that's much larger. And so, what I think would be very dangerous is for us to be limiting, becoming myopic in our focus on China, trying to apply a kind of Cold War framework to it, and actually missing a lot of the other really genuine risks that we face and not adequately safeguarding ourselves against them.
Well, I can't resist asking you, Ash, the same question about, is this a Cold War with China, and what do platforms and frameworks like the D10 mean for that kind of geopolitics?
Yeah, it's a great question. This rhetoric about the Cold War, I agree with Sophia, can be somewhat unhelpful because it brings up a lot of kind of pre-existing notions about what that means. The notion of a Cold War strikes to many as some kind of a military confrontation in which nuclear powers are, potentially on the verge of conflict. And that's certainly not the case with China. It shouldn't be where we're headed. I don't think it is where we're headed. But on the other hand, it is important to recognize, as has already been stated earlier today, that this systemic competition, this idea that China is taking measures across different platforms to undermine the rules-based order and the values underpinning that order, that's real. That is something that Beijing, that Xi Jinping has taken on board as his own way of looking at the world. It's not something the U.S. or the West chose to do or to have, but it's the reality of the situation. And I think we, the leading democracies of the world, need to be prepared to step up and to stand up to what is really happening out there. And that can mean kind of pushing back on China, and militarily defending countries like, or defending areas of the world where we have interests. It can also mean, and should mean, putting China increasingly under sanctions where it's warranted, for instance, with regard to their human rights violations against the Uyghurs, or at least targeting those sanctions in ways that are most effective. And it means just taking steps to position ourselves to compete more effectively on technology and in other areas. And so I wouldn't call that a Cold War, but I would certainly suggest that it's the reality of a kind of new era. I think the Biden administration has captured it well, calling it an era of strategic competition, great power competition. And also, I wanted to echo what Jonathan said about the consensus that's building around these ideas that came out of the G7 summit. The communique, the statement that the leaders issued, went far beyond anything we've seen in the past, where these terms like strategic competition were used and were joined in by all of the G7 partners, both with regard to the challenges from China and also Russia, and pushing back on or highlighting the need to defend the rules-based international order. So I think that there's a lot of room for optimism about the pathway towards reaching consensus and alignment among democracies on these issues, at least with regard to framing the threat and the challenge. Now, the hard part, I think Ambassador Fried said earlier, is how do you go from these kinds of statements of solidarity and alignment and now come to the practical matter of agreeing on a way forward. We're just starting to see that happen in a number of different areas, but there's still much more work to be done.
Thank you. We've got time for one more question, unfortunately, which I'd like to put to Jonathan. It's a question from the audience, from Julian Lark. What do supporters of multilateralism think about the continued importance of Donald Trump to the Republican Party, and what that could mean in the future about the shape of US foreign policy? So I've only got 2 minutes left to answer that question, Jonathan.
Oh, so sorry, could you just repeat that one more time?
So what do proponents of increased multilateralism or global multilateralism think about the continued importance of Donald Trump and his movement to the Republican Party, and all that might mean about the future of US foreign policy and the direction of the American polity in general?
Yeah, very good question. And to give you a little bit of a Canadian perspective, and also one from Japan, where I spend a good amount of my time in normal circumstances, I think there's been a recognition that definitely the last 4 years have been challenging, I think, for the Canadian administration and in some senses, the Japanese, although I think they took their advantages with some of the transactionalism of the previous administration. But I think one of the fundamental takeaways, and I think this should be a fundamental takeaway, and I don't think all subscribe to this, is the idea that we're not going back to 2008, or we're not going back to the idea that this was some aberration, and that some of the challenges or questions on the value of multilateralism, or some of the difficulties on frankly, longstanding discussions, whether it's on alliance burden sharing, whether that's in a NATO context or whether that's in a bilateral alliance context. The reality is a lot of these are very legitimate discussions. I think it's just the way that they the previous administration went about them obviously was not the most desirable. So I think there's a sense, at least for many that I talk to here in Canada and also in Japan, is that we need to understand that these realities will continue to exist. In many senses, some elements of them continue to exist in this current administration, just formulated in a very, very different way. So I think that we have to realize that some of the challenges that were presented by the previous administration will pop up again, and they're not necessarily uniquely tied to the possibility of Donald Trump being reelected or something else. So I believe that's the sentiment, is that, rather than think that this is yesterday's paper, that we have to be aware that these things could pop up again.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And thank you to all of our panelists for what's been a kind of really thrilling discussion about the future shape of global order and engaging with new partners. So now I'd like to pass the digital baton on from my bedroom into the next virtual study on the other side of the world. And I'd like to introduce Maureen Boud, Fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute and Senior Fellow at the Norman-Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. Thank you, Maureen.
Ben, thank you very much for your engaging moderating style. I loved it. And I thank your panelists for their comments on engaging democracies in Asia. This session is looking at Canada's role in transatlantic relations, and our framework is including key areas of Canadian partnership, priorities and expectations in the renewal of transatlantic relations, and areas for Canada to seize new opportunities. We have three terrific panelists. I'm going to introduce them in reverse alphabetical order. Ben Roswell is President and Research Director of the Canadian International Council. Ben's a former diplomat. He served as Canada's ambassador to Venezuela and had postings in Egypt, to the United States, and in Canada's permanent mission to the United Nations. I think Canadians remember him as Deputy Ambassador to Afghanistan and head of the NATO Provincial Reconstruction Team in Kandahar. And not surprisingly, Ben is intensely interested in human rights and democracy. David Reid is the British Deputy High Commissioner to Canada. David has been Deputy High Commissioner to Canada for almost 2 years. He's a lawyer, and particularly relevant to today's discussion, has worked in both the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and the Cabinet Office, where he focused on EU affairs. He served as Deputy Head of Mission in Warsaw and at the British Embassy in Paris, where he was responsible for justice and home affairs cooperation. Our third panelist is Dr. Bruce Jones. He's the Director of the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. He's an international security expert, director, and a senior fellow in the Project on International Order and Strategy at Brookings. He also works with the Center for East Asia Policy Studies. He's currently focusing on U.S. strategy, international order, and great power relations. He's also worked on the geopolitics of energy and climate change. And I also point out that Bruce is Canadian. I'm looking forward to hearing from all of you. And let's start with Ben Roswell. And Ben, the CIC, the Canadian International Council, has just finished a comprehensive consultative exercise on what Canadians want in their foreign policy. Can you talk about your findings and specifically your recommendations about our transatlantic relationship?
Thank you very much, Maureen. I appreciate the introduction. We have just completed a major exercise with a sample of 444 Canadians that are exactly representative of the full national population, combined with some of the results of another program we've done with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung on the future of the transatlantic relationship. I think we have some insights to share. The project was based on the intuition that as we're discussing how liberal democracies might collaborate more in the face of a very challenging, increasingly challenging international order for our system of government and set of values, that perhaps we should be looking for commonalities between us and other liberal democracies, not necessarily in who we might stand together in opposing or in building on existing institutions, because we got together to solve other problems back in the 1940s and found those institutions sort of useful, and let's build on what's already there. But that perhaps there's something about the nature of democratic practice as it's evolving in various countries. This is probably an area of weakness for the United States, because I think there's widespread recognition that the evolution of American democratic practice is quite unnerving and quite disturbing. And therefore, there's a desire in US-led visions of liberal democratic collaboration to step away from the discussion or to try and find sort of silver linings in the cloud of American democratic practice. But I think there's some areas of both German and Canadian democratic practice that might be quite promising to look at. The coming to terms with the past, the management of migration, the traditions of pluralism, and as we identify domestic democratic practices that sometimes, not always, we have been discovering up to 1,000 mass graves of children and coming to confront our own genocidal past. But I think that's all part of the value that we bring as a democracy to international relations, that there might be something in that domestic experience. So the areas that we're looking at for where Canada and Germany might be able to find some common grounds and an agenda on which to build to bring into this broader renewal of the transatlantic relationship would be starting with the traditions of pluralism and the management of migration, moving on to the challenges that technology has posed to our civil society and practice of democracy. Then from that to some of the shared global challenges that we all face and how we might bring our own unique citizen-focused approach to that, whether it's global public health or climate change. And then finally to the international agenda of how we support democracy in other countries, how we deal with international peace and security, and what kind of institutions we build out of all this. So I think if there's some kind of conclusion from all of this, and we saw this from the 444 citizens that we engaged with, there's a deep recognition of the character of our country as a democratic society, and desire to base our international relations on that character, to link what we're doing abroad with what we're doing at home as we're pursuing human rights for others, recognizing that we've got a long way to go here, but then drawing from those lessons that we're learning domestically to drive an international agenda in a way that might be framed quite differently than it was either in the Cold War or frankly the post-Cold War era. We're still after a rules-based international order, but new rules to face new problems and new institutions to facilitate that collaboration.
Great, thanks. And I want to come back to a lot of that in the discussion to come. But first, I'm just going to, I'd like to give everybody a chance to talk, and then we'll branch out into other areas. And so my next question is to David Reed. And David, noting that you're a serving diplomat, what role would the United Kingdom like to see Canada assume in the transatlantic relationship?
Sure. Thank you, Maureen. And let me start by congratulating Ben and the CIC for their work. And in thinking about that question, I'm going to draw a little bit on the UK's own review of its international policy, which looked at foreign policy, development policy, defence policy, called the Integrated Review. And one of the main conclusions of that was that the UK needed to work more with partners like Canada on the key issues of the day. So when I was thinking about Canada's role, I think I pulled out 4 things. I think the first is there is a real value in working with Canada as a like-minded actor on top security issues. And I think that stems from us having access to the same intelligence and an ability to move rapidly. And we've seen a lot of that, particularly working with US colleagues on China, Hong Kong, Belarus, on the foreign policy space, but also some important attributions in terms of cyber espionage when it comes to malign activities by some other states. I think the second thing is, I think Canada's got a really important role to play as a convener. I think Canada has credibility, expertise, and ability to pull together networks of countries. And just 2 examples of that recently, I think, were the work that the UK and Canada did to build and grow the Media Freedom Coalition, but also the work that Canada led on arbitrary detentions. I think third thing for me is thought leadership. I think Canada's got a really important role to play when it comes to some of these big questions about reform of international institutions. And I think here, for example, about the Ottawa Group and the work that Canada's been doing on WTO reform. The UK has just joined that group and wants to be a key part of that. But also some of the issues around WHO reform and how we make sure we're better placed for the next pandemic. And the final thing I think I'd draw out would be sort of Canada's increasingly important role as a development actor. And I think Canada has carved out a really important niche on gender in terms of girls' education, sexual health and reproductive rights. But increasingly, I think the most important thing in the next few months is COVID and how countries like the UK, the US, Canada, European partners can work together to ensure that we get as many vaccines as possible out to the developing world. Because whilst conditions here in Ottawa and back in London, I was there last week, are improving, I think COVID's with us for at least a few more years, even in best case scenarios. And some of the risks to stability around the world if we can't vaccinate those who need it quickly. So I think Canada's role there in stepping up, including the most recent donation of more AstraZeneca vaccines, is really important. So I'd focus on those 4 things.
Great. Thank you very much. And again, a lot there that we can come back to. And questioners do start getting ready to for the part of the conversation when we're going to go to your questions. But next to Bruce Jones. And Bruce, one issue that unites the Europeans and Canadians is an effective World Trade Organization. And the US under President Trump effectively froze dispute resolution by refusing to appoint any new judges. Ambassador Reeker spoke about economic cooperation, specifically about suspending the Airbus-Boeing dispute. Why aren't we seeing more progress on dispute settlement at the WTO?
Well, in truth, I'm not much of an expert on WTO issues, so I won't give you a too in-depth answer there, but I will note that the Biden administration is not particularly warm to the WTO. There's a lot of concern in the United States about the way the WTO dispute resolution mechanisms have not succeeded, about the way they've not addressed issues of state subsidy, about the number of themes that China has been able to get away with, and many others as well. And so I think there's quite a strong domestic resistance to substantial re-engagement with the WTO on the part of the Biden administration. So it's not, frankly, where I would look first to re-engagement between Canada and the United States, let alone in the broader community of democracies or the broader transatlantic relations.
Okay, thanks. Let me just turn to David Reid on that. Noting that the UK has a post-Brexit agenda and that you'd like to find new trading relationships, and you've already applied to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Where are you on transatlantic relationships, where the possibilities, and maybe even joining the NAFTA, although who wants to renegotiate that? I don't know. But if you want to talk about that a bit.
So I think it's fair to say we've got a busy couple of years ahead. So with trading negotiations on new free trade agreements with Canada, with the US, with Australia, with New Zealand, with Japan. There's a busy agenda in terms of bilateral agreements. And I think depending on political developments in Canada, we're looking forward to kicking off negotiations on a new FTA probably later in the year. Then there's the desire to join CPTPP, which is moving at pace, and very grateful for the support of Canada and others on that. I'm not sure about NAFTA. I think we've probably got enough on our plate for the moment. But I think there's also an element around how we work together on some of those broader trade issues, including on supply chains. And I think one of the things that struck me during the COVID pandemic, particularly in the early stages, was how much work we had to do with Canada jointly to try and keep supply chains open in terms of PPE and medical supplies. And I think there's a piece of work going on with EU partners as well, looking at how we ensure that this doesn't happen again, that we don't revert to protectionism when we need to keep trading channels open the most. So I think those are sort of the key priorities for us. And I think if in 2 or 3 years' time we come out of this with a new FTA with Canada, membership of the CPTPP, and active membership of the groups looking at WTO reform, I think that's our 3 priorities.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. I want to go back a little bit to what Ben was talking about and promoting democratic governance. And I'm saying this wearing my hat as chair of the Parliamentary Centre, as the Parliamentary Centre is committed to furthering inclusive democratic values and particularly increasing capacity in parliaments and legislatures. And one of the tropes is that there are lots of Canadians working in promoting democratic governance abroad. They just aren't working for Canadian organizations. But I want to say right now, we've been encouraged by recent conversations with Global Affairs Canada for greater support in this area. And I'd like to ask whether the 3 of you believe that this is an area where the Canada and the transatlantic community could make specific gains and by greater cooperation in promoting democratic ideals. And I'll start with Ben. You talked about it a little bit, if you can expand a bit more.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, it's a charged topic, obviously, because the support of democracy in previous decades has tarnished the particular way that it was done, say in Iraq, has tarnished the reputation and cast the legitimacy of the transatlantic relationship in doubt as we've attempted to export those values elsewhere. I do think that there's something in the practice, not so much of Canadians in all those other organizations, and I was definitely one of them at one point, but the Canadian government in the democratic crisis in Venezuela offers some insights on how to do so between democracies in a way that honors the international rule of law and the multilateral traditions that I think are common to the Canadian practice and, say, the German practice. The first is the principle of sovereignty, that the citizens of the country have the absolute right to determine their government, not only in the face of other political actors domestically, but also in the face of outside military actors, regardless of how democratic those outside actors are. Popular sovereignty, the sovereignty of the citizens of the country. Secondly, it's the international community should act when there's clear local leadership of a democracy movement. That should be a litmus test of whether we act or not. And third, we must always act multilaterally and with neighboring countries and regional countries. If we were to honor those 3 principles of supporting democracy, there are certainly no shortage of democratic crises around the world, not only in countries that are authoritarian, where there might be some question of whether there really is the tradition of those institutions, but even in the heartland of countries that have been democratic for very long. And I would say not only are there opportunities to do so, but there's a necessity to do so, that our system of government and our system of values is under coordinated attack, or at least contestation around the world. And eventually that will affect the legitimacy and the practice of democracy in our own countries. And so the defense of these ideals in our own country, I think, actually brings an obligation to stand up for those principles abroad, as long as it's done in full respect of the sovereignty of the citizens of other countries and in following their leadership as they claim their rights.
Great, thanks. Thanks for that. I wanted to turn back to Bruce. Bruce, to have, if you can make some comments on this, but also if you also want to make some more broader comments about where Canada fits in the transatlantic relationship.
Sure, I'll try to link the two. So I confess I don't prioritize democracy promotion as a theme. It seems to me that we should be very focused on defense of democracy, and I mean that both internally and and internationally. There are serious challenges to democracy, to the democracies, to the role of democracies in international order right now, coming from China, coming from Russia, coming from elsewhere. And it seems to me extremely important that the major democracies are working closely together to defend core interests and core values. This building on the themes that Ash and others talked about in the last panel, from my vantage point, that really means linking more effectively the Pacific, the European, and the Americas communities versus thinking about this in a transatlanticist format. That being said, there are, of course, places where you want to be working together to promote development, promote technologies, promote economic growth, and governance questions alongside that. Canada has a role to play in that. I think Canada has an important role to play in the horribly named B3W initiative born out of the G7. There are Canadian private sector entities that are pretty significant players in some of the sort of contracts that are likely to come around through B3W in the energy space and the mining space. An important challenge for Canada is that in its private sector, much like parts of the European private sector, are not really on board on the idea of putting distance between themselves and the Chinese and others. So there's some work to be done there. And then also building on what David had to say, I do think in the multilateral space, Canada's been a key innovator in multilateral arrangements, and sort of defending democracy, defending key values in the multilateral system is a really important job right now, but also innovating and adapting that system to meet the demands of the current moment, which it doesn't at present. And Canada really can play a crucial role there as well.
Great, thanks. David, do you want to react to that?
Yeah, I think one of the key things for the G7 this year has basically been to show that multilateralism works, and that I agree that probably democracy has been on the defensive for the last couple of years, but these last 6 months or so I think have shown that you can tackle global challenges effectively. So I think the G7 really needed to show that it could align on COVID, that it could align on China, that it could align on climate change. And I think it probably exceeded expectations there. So I think there's still a big job to do in terms of defending democracy, but also just showing that when it comes to these big global challenges, actually democracy works better than autocratic government. And I think the next 6 months or so are going to be particularly key on that as we approach the big climate summit in Glasgow in November.
We've recognized today that we have shared values. We may agree on the threats, but not exactly on the solutions or even the approaches, let alone the urgency of the threats. In Canada, we're expecting an election sooner or later. Certainly, this Liberal government considers climate change a priority. But is this an area where Canada could be doing more in the transatlantic relationship? And I think I'd like to ask Bruce on this one, because you've done work on climate change.
I mean, it's tricky, right? Canada is the highest per capita energy user in the world. It's a big, empty, cold place. I know. I spent quite a number of my young years being very cold in Ottawa. So in sort of real practical terms, is Canada a leader on climate change? I think it's not really. But Canada can certainly support diplomacy on this if its policy moves in that direction. I actually, to be honest, though, I think that the real issue in climate change is different. It's not about the transatlantic relations. It's really about the kind of biggest emitters: India, China, the United States, and the Europeans. So Canada, I think, at best can play a facilitation role there. But that does build on something, again, that David said too. I do think that Canada's convening capacity, its quiet diplomacy capacity, its capacity to act as a source of restraint in crisis management, those are all key diplomatic attributes that Canada has exercised in the past, hasn't always done so of late. But those are sort of muscle memories that Canada should recall, because we're going to need all those kinds of tools to navigate through the major global challenges and the major strategic challenges that we have in front of us.
Okay, this fits into an audience question. So I'm going to go to that first because you're talking about quiet diplomacy. There's a question from Simeon McKay. Does Canada damage its brand and credibility in the EU if it appears too close to the UK? For example, as an example, the vague UK-driven shared values campaign. So anyone want to take that one on?
Shall I have a crack at that, Maureen?
Sure, that would be terrific.
So you won't be surprised to say that I disagree. I think on a lot of these big challenges that we're facing, actually, it's been a coalition of the UK, the US, Canada, and European partners. So I'm thinking back to the major package of sanctions against China in relation to human rights abuses in Xinjiang. And I think what had impact there was the fact that it was coordinated between the EU, the UK, the US, Canada, and there was also safety in numbers. And I think I look back at sort of the other bigger foreign policy challenges over the last 6 months or so, whether it's Belarus, whether it's Ukraine. And again, I think in most of those, we've seen Canada, the US, the UK, and European partners acting together. So I think I would say there are certain things that are done well between the UK and Canada, and sometimes membership of the Five Eyes Intelligence Sharing Alliance helps that happen more quickly than it might do with other coalitions. But what's been most effective has been when we've worked with European partners as well. So I think the ideal is on these big challenges, including COVID, that we have a coalition that stretches across the Atlantic and includes big European partners and indeed the EU. And I think that's the sense we got from the G7 summit, was that we had the EU, France, Germany, Italy, US, Canada joining together on these big issues. So I would say no to that question, and that would be my reasoning.
Great, thanks very much. I am happy to let Bruce or Ben go back onto that. Ben, do you want to add anything further?
Yeah, it's not necessarily to disagree with David. I think, Canada and Britain share a lot of values. I would issue a note of caution, though, about any collaboration that Canada has with other liberal democracies that focuses on our shared language or Commonwealth background. Personally, I think the Five Eyes grouping, very useful for intelligence sharing, really not the right group for expanding collaboration. It does work very well. It's, there's 75 years of collaboration between the Five Eyes, but what do we have in common with each other apart from being liberal democracies, which is what we share with all kinds of others? Apart from this history, I think it's extremely limiting to the collaboration we need with the liberal democracies. I think where there's some real shared values that are excluded from that, and I think Germany in particular. So yes, bilaterally, Canada and the UK, we're happy to follow along with UK initiatives. We do a great job, like when it comes to media freedom, I think, as David pointed out. Not so sure whether we should be building on our linguistic or ex-imperial ties as a basis for building liberal democratic institutions for the future. I think we should be doing those on the basis of where those values lie right now, not where we may have had shared values decades or even centuries past.
Thanks. Bruce, do you want to I'd like to come back to you just on this, just to finish off the circle.
No, I don't think there's any way that Canada damages its relations with the EU. I do agree with Ben in part. I mean, I do think that the powerful liberal democracies is different than the liberal democracies writ large. And so sort of smaller groups of liberal democracies working together matters quite a lot, but absolutely Germany, France, Spain, countries that are not part of the Five Eyes need to be an important part of that. Korea, Japan, again, with this theme of sort of building tighter relations between the Asian, the American, and the European democracies.
Thank you. So I invite the audience to submit any questions. We are at that stage where I will ask a few, and I see some that come in. I do have one come in from Ashfaq Ahmed. China and Russia both have one-party rule. It makes them autocratic states. How can transatlantic partners with two-party systems be labeled as democracies? I'm not sure who wants to take that one on. Ben, I'm going to give it to you.
Well, I mean, it seems like there's an obvious answer. There's a world of difference between one party and two. There's an alteration of power, which means that sometimes the people that are in power get held to account, and that citizens at the end of the day have some control over their political fates. It's I don't think we should be focusing on parties as the key unit of organization and whether a state is democratic, but rather on citizens and whether they have a say over how they're governed.
Thanks for that. I did want to give the opportunity to answer. But let's just turn now to Canada's role in engaging rising democracies, including India and Brazil. And Bruce, do you see a role? What role do you see for Canada here?
Yeah, I think this is critical. Although I'm not really sure we should be using the phrase rising democracies to talk about India, since it has a larger economy than Canada, right? But building coalitions with non-Western democracies strikes me as the critical component of what we're trying to do collectively here, pulling them into deeper collaboration where their interests overlap, forging the habits of diplomatic coordination with countries like India, Chile, Mexico. Brazil is obviously in a very complicated moment right now, but we should not neglect it in the future. That work is essential. I think Canada is well positioned there. Some of that work is going to have to be done by the United States, that's kind of the top power. But sometimes it's not the top power that should forge ties or should help build relations or set agendas. Sometimes middle powers can play very important roles there, and I think Canada is well placed to do that. I think that's a critical part of the storyline.
Okay, I just ask David the same question, and then I'm going to branch out to another.
I'm going to agree. I think one of the things that's been interesting in the last few months has been the reinforcement of this idea that you should build out from the G7 to include big democracies. So for the G7 summit, we had South Korea, India, Australia, South Africa. ASEAN was involved with some of the run-up work around foreign and development policy. And I think increasingly, particularly if you're looking at big issues like how do you handle strategic competition with China, you need a big coalition. And again, when you look at some of these initiatives that Canada has launched, including on arbitrary detentions, I think they consciously looked at expanding beyond this sort of normal, slightly narrow list of like-minded partners to include, I think we're up to about 50 members or so now. So I would agree. I think you need to think large about sort of how you can work with middle powers and including smaller democracies as well, rather than just concentrate purely on your big seven.
Okay, thanks. Ben, I'm going to ask this first question to you. So in engaging with democracies, however we want to describe them, are diaspora and expat communities a help or a hindrance in deepening ties? Is Canada making good use of these communities to further our foreign policy?
There's probably elements of both. If you look at it from a practitioner, a professional diplomat who wants to have some degree of control over the agenda and some degree of control of access to the advice that goes to a minister. In general, now that I'm outside of government, I suppose I could say this. I do find that professional diplomats, professional foreign services are far too reticent about diasporas, far too focused on the costs and not on the advantages. I think we've seen the power of diasporas in countries that do embrace them. And here I should actually point out not only, say, diaspora communities of new Canadians, Canadians that have come from other countries and have become part of our national mosaic, as it were, but also the diaspora of Canadians abroad. Some countries have been far more successful in branching out and engaging their citizens abroad. I think it's part and parcel of international relations in which individuals and communities of individuals, not necessarily organized along national or state lines, play an increasing role. We saw that in many of the democracy movements around the world. I mean, think most recently of Belarus and the strong role that Belarusians outside of the country have played. We saw that in the Arab Spring with Arabs outside of the countries. Those diasporas can be reservoirs of both political strength and of commitment to international norms in addition to, competitors with professional diplomats for advice that go to the political leaders that set policy. And so I certainly hope that Canada and other countries will start to embrace both the diaspora's presence in their own country and the diasporas of their own citizens abroad as we draw on the power of citizens for advancing democratic ideals in the world.
Thanks, Ben. And Bruce, this kind of sort of backs into a question from an audience member, Madeline Johnson. Thank you, Madeline, for your question. She writes, some of these conversations are hinting toward an important issue we're all wrestling with, namely the impacts of historic colonialism and ongoing systemic racism in our countries. How can we incorporate these dynamics in the conversation and in thinking about our positions and relationships with Russia and China? What are the implications of that discussion?
It's a really good, important question. I actually think a lot about it. It's one of the reasons why I'm not so convinced that the framing of the kind of transatlantic community, the political West, is the right framing for the moment. I think in large parts of the world, there's been a resurgence of sort of fatigue of having the West try to dictate the play. There's a lot of frustration with the West over the way we've managed the economic and vaccine response to COVID. People are well aware of our history as colonial powers. Canada isn't a colonial power, but that's an exception of racism in our societies. I think we have to take that seriously. If all we want is sort of tighter coordination on ourselves, we don't have to worry about that stuff, but we don't. We want to be engaging in lots of different regions with lots of other countries. So we have to be very aware of sort of how we frame the issues we're grappling with, how we talk about these issues. I'll use the occasion to say, by the way, I wish we would all just drop the notion of a rules-based order. It's analytically weak and it's politically tone deaf. It is not the right basis on which to organize this work. And this history that the West has is a major problem. The rest of the world is much more capable than it was 20 or 30 years ago to self-organize. It's much more sovereign, to put in those terms. It's much more capable of mounting its own diplomatic initiatives and has alternatives. And if the West, the political West, or the democracies want to compete in those terms, it has to be conscious of its history. And we have to be conscious of our history, conscious of the flaws in our systems, and conscious of how we frame what it is that we want to do. And a lot of the discussion I find around rules-based order and the transatlantic West is a very tone-deaf framing.
Great. Bruce, I'm just going to follow up with you another question. Where do you see the reframing of global security architecture? Any complements or adaptations to NATO or other fora like OSCE where Canada could also play a role?
I think it's a really important question. It's going to be very challenging, but there's no real doubt in my mind that we're going to have to find, probably not alliances in the first instance, probably informal ways in the first instances, but again, in this theme of linking the security capabilities of the key Asian democracies, countries like Australia, Korea, Japan, et cetera, and the security capabilities of Canada, the United States, and the key European powers. Whether that emerges as kind of a 4+4, a Quad +4 mechanism, or NATO plus, don't know. But there's no real question that I'm going to steal a phrase that David used. Big issues require big coalitions. Dealing with China's growing naval capability, dealing with China's technological capability, that's going to require a big coalition in the security space. And that must involve both the Asian and the European as well as the American democracies. So the architecture for that can be, an expanded version of the D11. It can be a 4+4, but there's no question we're going to need something along those lines.
Great, thanks. Now I'm going to ask all three of you a question. So Canada's obviously first and most important relationship is with the United States. We're talking about Canada's role today in the transatlantic community, but how would the panelists, all of you, assess the Biden administration's performance so far? Is it engaging Canada enough? Areas it should prioritize in relations with Canada? And let's start with David. Let's start with you. From your point of view.
So from where I'm sitting, probably the sort of number one international priority for the whole of the UK's diplomatic network is climate change. And the last 6 months have felt very different. And I think the engagement that the Biden administration has had with the government of Canada has been very positive in terms of raising the levels of ambition. And I think the commitments from Canada to raise its 2030 targets have been really important. But I think Canada has also helped to sort of push the US in some areas as well. So one of the things I draw out would be Canada's commitment to double its climate finance. I think that is something which has helped as well. So I think there is a two-way conversation going on, particularly on the climate agenda, where there is a bit of sort of almost healthy competition between Canada and the US, and also UK, EU. So I think that dynamic has really changed. I think elsewhere, I think there have been some really good examples of practical, quick collaboration on some of the big security challenges over the last few months, and that has been a sort of a positive. I think one thing that hasn't changed is maybe the conversation around defence spend. So I think the conversation between NATO partners on how we get up to 2%, how we make sure that NATO is equipped for the challenges that are coming. I think that's something that perhaps hasn't changed that much between the two administrations. But overall, it feels like after the G7 summit in Cornwall, we're able to say multilateralism is back and the G7 is back. And a lot of that is down to President Biden and the work he's been doing to restore support for multilateralism and working with allies and things like climate change. So pretty positive, I would say, from where I'm sitting.
Great, thanks. Let's go to Ben.
Yeah, I'm glad that David has a positive impression of our country, our government's response to the Biden administration. I'm a little bit more disappointed. I actually think the Biden administration is doing a good job of reaching out to Canada and to liberal democracies across the board. I mean, the change of tone, the change of priority, the real energy being put into international leadership on issues that matter to all of us out of the Biden administration is something to be celebrated. I think in terms of the sort of professional practice of the Canada-US relationship, which is an area of deep expertise in the Canadian government, there's a lot of pride placed on being able to take some of the tension out of the relationship and deal with it in entirely transactional terms and kind of segment the relationship, which was great in the Trump years when the big picture was so negative. I think the government was quite good at hiding its dismay, but it's not very useful in an era where there's real leadership and real drive coming out of Washington, and frankly, not as much of a response on the big picture from Canada. I'm worried that we're not responding as much to the American invitation for Canada to play a more significant role and for liberal democracies to really advance cooperation on issues that really matter now. I think Exhibit A in this is our very disappointing response on sharing vaccines abroad, for us to be such a laggard in the G7 summit that took place, offer such a small amount, and now only to offer a tiny amount of AstraZeneca doses that are about to expire. I mean, Canada has really failed to step up to the leadership role that I think reinvigorated American administration, and the greater energy that's now being placed in the collaboration of liberal democracies is a real opportunity missed. And I hope that Canada will step up its game in response to the opportunities presented by the change of government in the United States.
Good, thanks. Bruce, you've heard two different points of view there. What's your take?
Look, it's early days. Sort of half the foreign policy team isn't even in place yet, let alone nominated in some key cases. So let's leave it as a sort of TBD. And that's both on the bilateral front, some of the issues that have been raised, and on the multilateral front. Canada and the United States work incredibly closely together in multilateral institutions, whether it's the UN, the bank, NATO, etc. I don't see yet much conversation between the two foreign department, the foreign ministry and the State Department around the multilateral agenda, but that will come. The Biden team are beginning to think through what they want to do in that kind of space. And as they do, I think it's likely that they'll reach out to key partners, and Canada will be among them. Probably not exclusively, almost certainly not exclusively. So I don't worry about it. It does allow me to raise an issue that hasn't come up at all so far, where I think Canada has a really important role to play, and one that matters increasingly in the United States, which is the Arctic. I do think we'll see the Biden administration putting a lot of emphasis on the Arctic, and I hope we'll see very strong sort of diplomacy from Canada to engage with them and others on that. Canadian, European, and American interests aren't exactly the same in the Arctic, but I think we all have a pretty strong interest in seeing a set of mechanisms in place to limit what both the Russians and the Chinese are starting to do in the Arctic. And that may be an early place for Canada and the United States to kind of deepen the engagement.
Great. Thanks very much. I'd like to give, we're just about at the end. I'd really like to give everyone just a moment, a minute or so, of a minute and a half of closing remarks on what your final thoughts are. And after hearing from the different sessions, particular challenges Canada needs to be concerned with, Canada's main priorities and expectations, and the renewal, what's the way forward from here on in? Your last opportunity. And David, I'll start with you.
So I think one of my reflections from this discussion is that I think it would be really interesting if, following any election, there was a move in Canada to take some of the work that the CIC has done and think about a sort of more fundamental review of Canada's international approach, a bit like the UK's integrated review, a bit like some other countries have done, looking together at all the levers, development, foreign policy, defence spend, and thinking about sort of how Canada responds to some of the opportunities that have come out in this discussion. I think it's something that I think there are, from speaking to sort of colleagues and commentators here, I think there's maybe an appetite for that. And I think that would be an interesting and perhaps slightly overdue exercise. So I think maybe the CIC has helped sow the seed for some of that, but I feel like there's a market for that. So thinking about this discussion, having something which brings together the best people in the civil service here, consults widely, both with civil society and international partners, including the US and the UK, and thinks about how can Canada respond practically to some of these emerging opportunities.
Thanks. And Bruce, your final comments.
I really want to emphasize the issue of Canada's role as a middle power and its capacity to forge relations with similar countries, whether that's Germany, Spain, Korea, Chile, India. That relationship among the middle powers, I think, is going to be extremely important to whether or not we see the intellectual and policy innovation we're going to need in managing global issues, in having sort of mechanisms for quiet diplomacy, and having channels for crisis management. And so I really hope if, post-election Canada comes out of the gate swinging, that it's in that space, the role of the middle powers and the multilateral order, and in quiet diplomacy, and in forging the kinds of relationships and mechanisms we're going to need to navigate these very complicated challenges ahead of us.
Thanks. And Ben, the last word is yours.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think the biggest risk for Canada is that of a missed opportunity. There's not many moments in the international agenda when when issues are in such flux, where power relationships are changing so much. If we ever do get into a Cold War, which I hope we'll avoid, one of the real tragedies of a Cold War is just how static everything becomes and how difficult it is to change. That is not the case right now, even as China is growing and the United States is declining. There's a moment that's ripe for reframing international issues, for reinventing international institutions, for pressing forward with the development of new norms, and this moment of real dynamism in Europe and in Washington, whether that's in the transatlantic context or not, I think is one that Canada needs to be out in front of and not just responding cautiously to, as we have, say, in the global public health space. I think of the calls for a D10, the calls for a democracy summit. These are issues in which Canada's, or say the Quad in Asia. These are Canada's public responses, at least, of these have been a sort of caution. We're thinking about it. We're not really sure, but we're not necessarily either saying yes or no or coming up with our own views. We're really good at dealing with issues by issues, and I hope, whether it's through a national foreign policy review that David's mentioned, that Canada's going to be able to come up with a strategic response to be able to play as middle powers are meant to in the big power league, and coming up with ideas about how geopolitics should be organized. I think we do so not just on the basis of our geography, the fact that we're in the North Atlantic. I mean, that's why we're part of the transatlantic relationship, I suppose. But I couldn't agree more with Bruce's call for us to move beyond the geographic basis of our organization. What I think is significant about Canada and Germany and the United States, the United Kingdom and others, and countries in Asia and the Americas is this commitment to a way that we organize state-society relationship between the citizen and the states, the commitment to the rule of law and the dignity of the individuals. It's something about that common set of values where the greatest potential for collaboration lies and where the greatest power, collective power, can be organized between us to deal with the problems of the day. So I think that we should consider ourselves successful in these if we have these types of discussions about how our countries should express those values into concrete initiatives that change international outcomes. If we can frame those eventually, not in terms of the transatlantic relationship, but something like a trans-democratic partnership, that it should be about those common values and not just where we happen to be located in the globe.
Thank you, Ben. And I'd like to thank all three of you. You've given us a lot to think about. It was a rich discussion about Canada's role in the transatlantic community. I appreciate your time and your energy and your thoughts. And now I'm going to turn this back to the Atlantic Council to Dr. Matthew Kronig, who is the Deputy Director of the Scowcroft Centre for Strategy and Security. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Maureen. Thank you all for joining us for this event on the renewal of transatlantic relations in an era of strategic competition. We've been privileged to hear from some distinguished speakers, and we really thank them for their insights. A key takeaway for me is that the ability of the transatlantic community, the United States, Europe, and Canada, and really democracies globally to cooperate and come up with shared assessments of the strategic environment, shared strategies, I think will be important for helping us all to navigate successfully in this new era of competition. This event will be available in its entirety on the Atlantic Council YouTube page, and we plan to publish a paper on this subject in the coming weeks. And at the Scowcroft Center at the Atlantic Council, we'll continue to examine these issues about cooperation among democracies globally. So please keep us in mind for our work in this area. So thank you again to our distinguished speakers, to all participants. And now I would like to turn to Patricia Pena from Global Affairs Canada to offer her closing remarks.
Thanks very much to the Atlantic Council for organizing this morning's event, to all of our speakers, experts and moderators for your masterful contributions. I'm sure everyone will agree it was an excellent and very dynamic exchange, not always agreeing, but putting the issues out there so that we can have a thoughtful conversation. And we certainly covered a lot of ground. And as was just mentioned, a report will be prepared of today's discussion, and certainly it would help inform our thinking moving forward on transatlantic relations and what renewal might look like. If I can allow myself, I'd like to highlight just a few of the kind of maybe common themes that I heard coming out very briefly. First of all, the issue of many opportunities for collaboration. Transatlantic partners will need to be prioritizing and to strategize to build on our collective strengths while trying to navigate areas of policy divergence and unexpected events. So this is a daunting task. It will require discipline. It requires humility, acknowledging our own positions. Ben mentioned our own colonial past, but it is essential. Another point was an agreement on the need to focus on the alliance's efforts on global issues. So focusing on those areas of agreement rather than getting bogged down in, quote unquote, adversarial spirals. Convergence came up a lot as one of those words to guide our future work, to address common threats, climate change, issues relating to the Arctic, China's role in the global economy and political landscape, Russia as well, addressing global pandemics, cybersecurity, and other issues. And as we look to the transatlantic relationship, it can also have a role in strengthening other fora. So whether it's existing other multilateral institutions, minilateralism was mentioned several times, and alliances, and working with other partners to build a broader consensus, even those outside of the transatlantic alliance in its traditional sense. And we have to find vehicles for interaction and engaging with those that don't think like us, that might not be like-minded, but that are part of this global landscape of strategic competition. Canada's legacy of multilateralism was mentioned, and thanks to the comments on that. We're very proud of that, but we're also very humble about understanding our role in a global environment that is ever changing. We're committed multilateralists, but also recognize that we need to work in new and different ways to address some of these issues. And, you know, Ash mentioned a kind of technology alliance. The issue of regulatory and infrastructure cooperation is one of those areas that I know work is taking place now, and that will be very important. And then finally, what does success look like for us? You know, this conversation contributes to that. We'll have to figure out how to navigate national and global interests. And I would like to close with some cautious optimism and to thank everyone for joining us today from all around the world. And I look forward to ongoing discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. Thank you again to everyone for joining us virtually today. And we hope you have a good day, and we hope you'll join us again soon. Thank you.